The wind comes first. Not a whisper, a scream, rolling out of the black horizon like something alive. It claws through the harbor streets, rattling doors, snuffing out lanterns, and filling every breath with ice and iron. The air itself feels hunted. Snow begins to fall, sharp as ash, hissing against the windows. Somewhere far out on the water, a foghorn cries one long, broken note, and then silence. The kind of silence that makes you realize the world is listening. It is November 1913, the season when the Great Lakes stop pretending to be water. They turn to mirrors, then to monsters. Freighters leave the docks in proud defiance, their holds heavy with coal and their crews heavier with pride. But as the barometers plunge and the sky folds in on itself, the horizon disappears. Daylight dies too quickly. The storm has found them. By midnight, the lakes are unrecognizable. Waves climb like towers and crash like thunder. Masts snap, hulls scream. The night becomes a single, endless roar, and in that roar, a whisper. Not everyone will come home. Some called it a blizzard. Others said it was God. But history remembers it as the ghost storm, the deadliest nightmare to ever haunt the Great Lakes. Entire ships swallowed whole, entire crews erased without a trace, and along the frozen shores, widows lit candles that never stopped burning. So if you're hearing the wind tonight, listen closely, because the storm didn't end in 1913. It's still out there waiting for another ship to answer back. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more storms to weather, more ghosts to uncover, and more nights that never truly ended. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The wind carries farther than you think. The morning began with a hush so deep that even the gulls seemed reluctant to cry. A thin skin of frost glazed the harbor ropes, catching the light like veins of glass. Men moved slowly on the beak, docks, their breath rising in pale ribbons against the blue-gray air. The Great Lakes stretched out beyond them still, silver, endless, a mirror of November calm. No one yet knew that this would be the last morning of peace they would ever see. Captain George Mackay, of the Charles S. Price, stood at the edge of the pier, gloved hands in his pockets, watching the steam curl from his ship's funnel. The world seemed orderly, predictable. The air was cold but not cruel, and the barometer needle sat steady, indifferent. He thought of the cargo waiting to be loaded, coal from Sandusky bound for Sarnia, and of his wife, who had insisted he stay one more day ashore. But a captain lives by the clock, not by the heart, and the clock said it was time to sail. On the neighboring wharf, dockhands shouted through the fog as the Regina took on her final crates. The smell of oil and wet rope filled the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of apples from a shipment down the quay. Bells clanged, low and rhythmic, marking departures like a heartbeat. Across the water, the town still slept. Curtains were drawn, chimneys smoked faintly, and somewhere a church bell chimed 8 times. November 9th, 1913, a date soon to be carved into tombstones. The first sign came as a whisper, a stray gust that rippled the water just enough to blur the ship's reflections. No one paid it any mind. The Great Lakes had their moods, after all, and the sailors knew how quickly they turned. But this gust was different, sharper, colder, tasting faintly of snow. It carried the scent of something distant, something rising. One old deckhand paused mid-step, feeling the air tighten, and muttered a prayer he hadn't used since boyhood. By noon, the sky had begun to lose its color. The light flattened, pale as old bone, and the horizon melted into mist. Telegraph operators up the coast tapped out unusual readings, pressure dropping, winds shifting, but the messages traveled slowly, tangled in wires already heavy with frost. The towns along Lake Huron prepared for an ordinary storm. Shutters latched, wood stacked, children kept home from errands. They could not imagine that what was coming would tear the very roofs from their houses. As twilight fell, a strange stillness gripped the lake. The water turned to molten lead beneath a bruised sky. Even the wind withdrew, as if holding its breath before something unspeakable. Crews aboard the freighters leaned against railings, staring into that eerie calm where the world seemed paused between heartbeats. Somewhere, a distant rumble rolled across the horizon, a sound too deep for thunder, too far for waves. And then, as the lamps were lit one by one across the ships, the temperature plunged. Frost bloomed instantly on the glass. The first flake fell, a single white speck, against the dark steel of the deck. Then another, then 1,000 more. Within minutes, snow poured from the sky so thick it erased the horizon entirely. The sailors could no longer see the shore. They could not even see one another. Only the hiss of wind remained rising, circling, building into something vast and alive. It moved through the rigging like a whisper, then a scream. Far below, the barometer needle began to fall, and somewhere in the dark, the Great Lakes exhaled. The storm had begun. By dawn, the harbors had emptied into a grey and endless void. Steamers, bulk freighters, and schooners alike pushed out into the lakes, their hulls slicing the water with slow confidence. They were the pride of an age built on iron and fire, floating cities that hauled the fuel of empire through storms, fog, and frost. The men who commanded them believed they had tamed the inland seas, but on that morning, the Great Lakes waited with a stillness that was almost reverent, as if watching the fleet sail toward its judgment. From Duluth to Detroit, the great vessels moved in a loose procession. Charles S. Price, Wexford, Hydrus, Argus, Regina, John A. McGean, and dozens more. Each was loaded heavy with ore, grain, or coal, black dust clinging to deck boots, settling into every crease of the men's coats. Their engines beat like hearts inside iron chests, steady and proud, their stacks breathing white clouds into the frigid dawn. The crews went about their work with the easy rhythm of routine, unbothered by the faint snow swirling at their feet. On the Hydrus, a young deckhand named Walter Sinclair stood by the railing, watching the shoreline fade into mist. He was 23, with salt in his blood and frost on his eyelashes. Somewhere in Port Huron, a girl waited for him, letters folded neatly in her dresser, each signed yours until the thaw. He could not know that his last words to her were already written. Farther south, the Regina steamed out of Sarnia, her captain scanning the horizon with a wary eye. The air was colder than it should have been. The sky, though pale, carried a heaviness that unsettled him. He checked the barometer again. It had dropped slightly, nothing dramatic, but enough to whisper a warning. He jotted the reading into his logbook and closed it with a sigh. There was no turning back now. The season's final run meant bonuses, and the company expected every captain to deliver. Pride did the rest. By mid-morning, the fleet was scattered across the lakes like a constellation of moving stars, each ship tracing a white line of foam in the distance. Foghorns moaned through the rising haze, calling to one another in voices deep and mournful. The wind shifted west, then north, and a thin crust of ice began forming on the railings. Men chipped it away with hammers and laughed when the wind threw it back in their faces. They'd seen worse, they said. The lakes always bluffed before winter, but the bluff held too long. The air thickened, the horizon bent. The captains found themselves squinting into a wall of haze that seemed to pulse with light. Beneath their boots, the decks vibrated not from engines, but from the lake itself, heaving under the weight of something unseen. At noon, a telegraph message crackled through the static at Port Huron. Barometer falling fast. Winds reaching gale force. Advise all vessels to seek shelter. Few heard it. The wires were freezing, the signals faint, and most ships were already too far from shore to read the warning. By afternoon, snow began to fall, not gently, but with purpose. It clung to every line, every rivet, every breath. The visibility dropped to a few yards. From one ship to another, the world became an echo chamber of engines and wind. Crews lashed cargo, secured hatches, and spoke in short, clipped orders. Somewhere near Alpena, the Charles S. Price blinked her signal lamp to the Wexford, a simple message lost to the blizzard. Night came without sunset. The lake turned black, the wind turned white, and the Iron Fleet vanished into the storm. Each ship now carried its own small universe of fear and faith, sealed tight beneath the snow. Some prayed, some sang to drown the sound of the waves, and somewhere above them all, the storm gathered strength, its breath cold enough to stop the world. The Iron Fleet had sailed into history. Only the storm would write their names. It was the kind of cold that burned before it froze, the kind that sank into the bones and stayed there. On shore, in cities that lined the Great Lakes like beads on a chain, people woke to a sky the color of pewter. Snow drifted through the streets of Duluth, Toledo, Cleveland, and Sarnia. Horses stamped nervously at their reins, their breath steaming into the white. Shopkeepers brushed frost from their windows and turned on their lamps early, not knowing that by nightfall, many of those lamps would flicker in the dark. November was meant to bring closure, not ruin. The last ships of the season were out, heavy with their final cargoes before the freeze. They called these voyages the November Promise, one last run before winter sealed the lakes in ice. It was a promise of wages, of bonuses, of home by Christmas. Families lined the docks to wave as the great freighters vanished into mist, unaware that the goodbyes would become memorials. At the harbor in Cleveland, a dock worker named Henry Walsh leaned against a bollard and watched the Henry B. Smith disappear into the gray. His son, Thomas, served as an oiler aboard her, a boy of 19 who'd grown up chasing gulls along this very pier. Henry's wife had begged him not to go that season, not with the weather turning so mean, but Thomas had laughed and kissed her cheek. "It's the last haul, Ma," he'd said. "After this, we rest." She'd stayed to watch until the ship was a shadow, then nothing. The Henry B. Smith wasn't alone. From Superior, the Adela Shores pushed off just after dawn, her decks rimed in frost. The Hydra steamed east from Port Huron, her engines humming with quiet confidence. All across the lakes, captains noted the same small details: a drop in pressure, a restless wind, a sky that refused to lighten. But no storm had been forecast. No bulletins warned of disaster. The telegraphs spoke only of cold and light snow. And so, the promise of November held. By midday, the snow began to fall heavier. In Alpena, mothers called their children in from the streets, watching the white thicken over the harbor. "A lake storm," they said. "It'll pass." The wind howled softly through the rigging of ships still at anchor, and the water darkened like poured ink. No one realized the storm had two hearts, one raging from the south, one rising from the north. They were drawing toward each other, feeding on air and heat, destined to collide above Lake Huron. Out on the water, sailors began to feel at first the strange electric taste of the air, the way the waves rolled against the wind instead of with it. Snow came in bursts now, thick and fast, covering the decks faster than men could sweep them. Still, the captains pressed on. The shipping companies demanded delivery, and pride demanded obedience. Turning back meant failure, and no captain of the Great Lakes would bear that shame lightly. By nightfall, the horizon was gone. The world had shrunk to a circle of snow and steel. The wind sang through the rigging, like a voice calling from another world. Onshore, wives lit lamps in windows facing the water, small beacons of hope that no one would see. In the dark, the November Promise held fast and broke quietly. The ships pressed on, blind and brave, their lights flickering like stars swallowed by clouds. They were still sailing toward the future then, unaware that it was already closing around them like ice. The storm did not roar at first, it waited. The morning of November 9th broke with an uneasy calm that settled like a hand on the shoulder, firm but silent. Over Lake Superior, the surface was as smooth as molten glass, dark and perfectly still. The ships moved like slow-moving shadows across it, engines thudding in the distance, funnels trailing white ghosts of steam. To those who had sailed these waters all their lives, it felt wrong. The air was too heavy, the silence too absolute. and the horizon had turned a color no one could name, neither gray nor blue, but something in between, like metal, just before it cracks. Captain John Roan of the Hydra stood on his bridge with the weight of that sky pressing down on him. He had crossed the lakes 100 times, through storms and squalls that could rip a sail in half. But this was different. The stillness carried a sound, an absence of sound, really, that made even his crew whisper, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. The barometer needle had begun to fall again. He noted the reading in his logbook, his handwriting neat, but slower than usual. Pressure dropping. No wind. Farther south on Lake Huron, the Wexford cut a clean path through the water. Her hull, painted black and red, gleamed under the faint sunlight. The men on deck chipped ice from the railings and laughed about how strange it was to see the lake so calm this time of year. One of them said it felt like sailing inside a dream. Another muttered that dreams can drown a man just as surely as waves. The sky darkened without warning, not to night, but to something heavier, a ceiling lowering, closing. A line of grey formed along the western horizon, faint at first, then thickening into a bruise. Sailors began to notice small changes, the compass needle trembling, the air stinging like it carried sand. The sudden way sound travelled farther than it should. Every clang of metal, every cough or footstep echoed unnaturally, as if the lake were amplifying its own dread. At Port Huron, the harbour master stepped outside to take a reading. He found the air so charged with static that his hair lifted beneath his cap. A long roll of thunder, too low, too steady, moved across the sky, and then the birds disappeared. Not one gull remained in sight. They fled inland by instinct, leaving the shoreline silent. By late afternoon, the sun had vanished entirely. In its place was a dim, pearly light that made every wave look like glass and every ship a ghost. Sailors called it the glass sky, that eerie moment before a storm when the world turns still and reflective, when water and air seem made of the same cold substance. It was the breath before the scream. Men checked their lifeboats, tightened ropes, and double-bolted hatches. Some lit cigarettes with shaking hands. Others crossed themselves quietly, eyes never leaving that spreading bruise on the horizon. One officer aboard the Regina wrote a quick note to his wife. "Weather's changing fast. We'll be home soon. Don't worry." He tucked it into his pocket where it would stay, unread, forever. And then, as the first snow began to fall, slow, heavy, soundless, the wind turned. It did not rise so much as shift, as though the entire lake had drawn breath and decided to exhale. The glass sky shattered. The storm had found its voice. By the time the lamps were lit in the harbours of Cleveland and Sarnia, every captain still afloat knew something was wrong. The barometers, those delicate glass prophets that hung in every wheelhouse, had begun to behave like living things. Their needles, usually steady, were falling fast, quivering as if caught in invisible hands. The readings plummeted hour by hour, lower than any sailor had seen in his lifetime. Even the old-timers, men who'd braved the great storm of 1880 and the Black Friday gale of 1905, grew quiet. "It's dropping too quick," one said. "The lake's holding her breath." On the Charles S. Price, Captain Mackay stood beside the instrument, watching the mercury sink toward the bottom of the glass. 28:20, his first mate muttered, disbelieving. Mackay said nothing. The lamp's flame fluttered in the draught that seeped through the window seams, its light catching the captain's profile, calm, determined, but grave. He turned to his crew and ordered all vents sealed, all hatches battened. "We'll ride her out," he said. The words sounded confident, but in his chest something turned cold. Across the lakes, men leaned over their own barometers, eyes narrowing at numbers that made no sense. The air felt wrong, thicker, charged, a strange pressure inside the lungs. In Detroit, telegraph lines hummed with warnings. Gale forming unprecedented speed barometric collapse over Lake Huron. The message traveled north to Thunder Bay, west to Duluth, east to Goderich. but the wires were already frosting over, the signals breaking into static before many could read them. By midnight, the first storm front hit Lake Superior. It came not with thunder, but with soundless violence, a wall of wind and sleet that flattened the waves before raising them again, higher and harder. On the Hydrus, the lookout shouted that the horizon had vanished. Within minutes, they were sailing through white oblivion. The compass spun erratically. The decks groaned under the weight of ice, forming faster than men could break it. Inside the wheelhouse, the barometer was still falling. The captain stared at it, then at the window, where snow hurled itself sideways against the glass. He thought of his family in Cleveland and the warmth of their small house, the lamp that would be burning in the window. For a moment, he reached out a gloved hand to steady the barometer, as if he could stop the storm by touch alone. Meanwhile, in coastal towns, meteorologists scribbled in disbelief. The pressure drop covered all 5 lakes at once, an impossible phenomenon. Cyclone behavior, one wrote, shaking his head. 2 systems colliding. In essence, that's exactly what had happened. 2 massive fronts, one from the Arctic, one from the Gulf, meeting like armies over the Great Lakes. And the lakes, warm from the autumn, fed the storm's fury like breath to fire. At 1:45 a.m., a telegraph operator in Alpena tapped a final message before his wires went dead. Pressure 2780 and falling. God help them all. The storm was now fully awake. Out on the black water, captains clutched their charts and stared at dials that no longer meant anything. The wind screamed through the rigging, tearing words from men's mouths before they could speak. And on every bridge, the barometer hung like an executioner's clock, its needle sinking lower and lower still, toward the inevitable end. It began as a low hum, almost musical, like the sound of a bow drawn across a cello string. The air trembled with it, a note that deepened until the masts shivered and the lake itself seemed to answer. By dawn, the hum had become a roar. The wind came alive. It tore across the Great Lakes with a force that no chart could measure, dragging whole walls of snow and sleet in its wake. The world turned white, not with softness, but with violence. On the Wexford, men clung to the railings as the first gust struck broadside. The ship heeled hard, its deck tilting until the cargo chains screamed. "Hold fast!" the mate shouted, his voice instantly swallowed by the storm. The air was filled with saltless spray, shards of ice that cut through coats like knives. Within minutes, the temperature plunged below freezing. Breath turned to frost, eyelids crusted white. The sailors could no longer tell where sky ended and water began. Both had merged into one blinding wall of motion. The wind rolled, southward, gathering speed as it went, a living thing devouring everything in its path. In Cleveland, trees snapped like matchsticks. Roofs lifted and sailed into the dark. Telegraph poles bowed and cracked, their wires shrieking like the rigging of ships. On shore, women pressed against their windows, lamps flickering as the glass rattled in the frames. In the harbors, small boats tore loose and vanished into the foam. The Great Lakes were no longer seas, they were arenas, and the wind was the only master. Aboard the Regina, Captain Edward McConkie fought to keep control. The storm seemed to strike from every direction at once, 1,000 invisible fists battering the hull. He ordered more steam, but even the engine's great heart began to labor, the propeller thrashing in half air, half ice. "She's lifting out of the water," someone yelled. Another wave struck, drenching them in black spray. The captain wiped his eyes and looked toward the compass. It spun wildly, useless. Now. The wind grew in pitch, a shriek that seemed to carry voices. Some men later swore they heard their names called in it. Others claimed it laughed. It tore open cargo hatches, ripped lifeboats from their davits, and hurled them into the dark. Somewhere near Point aux Barques, a ship's funnel bent clean in half, steel screaming as if it were alive. The storm no longer needed the lake. It had become the lake. At 3 a.m., The wind struck Goderich with hurricane force. Entire houses slid from their foundations. The lighthouse beam vanished under sheets of snow so dense it looked like milk poured from the heavens. The keeper, Thomas Adams, tried to record the readings in his log, but his pen snapped under the shaking of the table. He wrote only one word before the ink froze: unreal. Out on the water, ships vanished one by one. The Hydrus, last seen struggling against the wind near Port Huron, sent no further signals. The Argus broke radio contact, her last transmission garbled, carried away by static. The Charles S. Price was still fighting somewhere in the blinding snow, her engines roaring into the void, and still the wind rose higher, screaming across the iron decks like something ancient and vengeful. It had slept for centuries, waiting for this perfect meeting of cold and heat, of pride and steel. Now it was awake and hungry. By dawn, the world no longer had a direction. There was only white above, black below, and the endless sound of the wind, wailing like the dead calling through the storm. Morning did not come on November 10th, it merely changed shade. Darkness gave way to a smothering grey that bled into white until the world vanished entirely. The horizon, that sacred line sailors lived by, was gone. There was no sky, no lake, only an endless white that moved and screamed and swallowed everything that tried to define it. To the men still alive on the Great Lakes, it felt less like weather and more like judgment. Aboard the Charles S. Price, visibility fell to nothing. Snow whirled in every direction, thick as fog, heavy as sand. The deck vanished beneath an inch of ice. Every railing, chain, and hatch was sheathed in glass so slick that even the most seasoned crewmen crawled on their hands and knees to move from bow to stern. The ship's whistle moaned every 30 seconds, its low, hollow cry fading instantly into the wind. Somewhere out there, another whistle answered, then another, distant ghosts calling to one another across the void. Captain Mackay gripped the wheelhouse rail, his knuckles pale through the frost. "Keep her steady," he shouted, though the helmsman could no longer hear. The compass spun uselessly, the needles dancing as if possessed. They might have been heading north, or south, or in circles. It didn't matter anymore. The storm had turned direction into a lie. Every wave slammed the hull with the force of a hammer, and each blow sent a shudder through the ship's iron spine. Below deck, cargo shifted, chains groaned, bolts snapped like bones. A few miles away, the Wexford fought her own invisible battle. The crew took turns breaking ice from the ventilators with hammers, their faces grey with exhaustion. "Feels like we're inside a cloud," one man said. His words turned to vapor before they reached his lips. The air was so full of frozen water that breathing burned. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. Men lost sight of each other on the same deck. Somewhere off the port side, they could hear the groan of another ship's whistle, then a crash, then silence. Whether it was collision or capsizing, no one could tell. From shore, there was nothing to see. The lakes had vanished behind a curtain of white that stretched from horizon to horizon. In towns like Bay City and Port Stanley, residents swore they could hear the storm screaming, though the water was miles away. It rattled their windows and shook their lamps, an invisible sea pounding at the world's edge. Telegraph lines were dead, power out, and all that remained was the sound, the ceaseless wind, like an animal clawing at the walls of heaven. Inside the Regina, Captain McConkie wrote his last log entry. His hand trembled so badly the ink froze in blotches. Impossible visibility, wind increasing, white everywhere. The rest of the words dissolved in a smear. A few of his men were still on deck, trying to free the lifeboats, but the ropes were frozen solid. When the next wave hit, it rose higher than the bridge itself. The ship shuddered, tilted, then righted again. For a moment, they thought they might survive, but the horizon never returned. It stayed white, featureless, infinite. Day and night blended into one eternal blur. The sailors' world had been erased, their ships left drifting through nothingness, as though the Great Lakes had forgotten they ever existed. And somewhere within that white horizon, unseen but certain, the storm gathered its full strength, ready to claim its first victims. By mid-afternoon, the lake no longer behaved like water. It had become a living thing, a moving wall that rose and fell with a strength that defied imagination. Sailors called them seas, these great swells of the inland oceans. But what thundered beneath the hulls of the Great Lakes fleet that day were not seas. They were beasts. They came from every direction at once, stacking on top of each other, colliding, folding, and exploding into spouts of white. The waves climbed the air like towers, 40, 50 feet high, and crashed down with the weight of small mountains. On the Charles S. Price, the crew had stopped counting the hours. Time had dissolved into the rhythm of impact, each crash a new eternity. The men lashed themselves to the bulkheads with rope to avoid being thrown across the deck. Every porthole glowed dimly with light filtered through water. When the ship plunged into a trough, the entire lake seemed to fall upon it at once, drowning the daylight and rattling the rivets until the steel screamed. Captain McKay gripped the railing as another wave slammed the bow and sent a shudder through the entire vessel. "Hold her into it!" he roared. But the wind made a liar of him. Aboard the Hydrus, ice had turned the decks to glass. The men moved in crawling crouches, using axes to chip free the ropes, frozen to the winches. The lake was throwing itself at them from every side, breaking over the smokestack, pouring through the ventilators. The helmsman, blinded by sleet, steered only by the feel of the rudder's resistance. They were no longer navigating, they were surviving minute to minute. When one wave smashed over the bridge, it tore a man clean off his feet and carried him overboard. His scream vanished into the gale before anyone could reach for a line. Somewhere farther south, the Regina was fighting the same leviathans. Her captain had ordered the ballast tanks flooded to keep her lower in the water, but it made little difference. The waves were not rolling, they were climbing. They rose from the surface like pillars, their crests breaking against the sky. From the deck, the men could see water above them, walls of green and white, trembling before collapse. Each wave struck with the sound of collapsing masonry, and the ship responded with deep, agonized groans. One engineer shouted that the hull plates were buckling. The captain only nodded. There was nowhere to run. On the shores of Lake Huron, the people of Goderich gathered by instinct at the water's edge. Though they could see nothing but white, they felt the ground trembling beneath their boots, a dull vibration that came and went like the pulse of a giant heart. In the distance, they heard the rumble of surf, though no one could tell where lake ended and land began. One woman swore she saw the outline of a ship's stern rise above the snow before disappearing again. It might have been a trick of the wind or the last moment of the Wexford. Night returned, early. The sky and lake merged into one heaving blackness streaked with spindrift that flashed like lightning in the lantern light. The waves no longer crashed, they struck, slamming iron and wood alike with such violence that seams burst and bolts snapped. Ships rolled to impossible angles and righted again, shedding cargo, lifeboats, and men into the freezing water. The sound was constant, mechanical, inhuman. The creak of steel, the howl of wind, the endless boom of waves that could climb, and above it all, the storm kept breathing long, steady, tireless, like a god awakened and unwilling to sleep. At 8:05 that night, a faint Morse transmission crackled across the icy airwaves from somewhere in the middle of Lake Huron. The words were clipped, the rhythm uneven, interrupted by static. It came from the Regina. The message was brief. Heavy seas cannot make headway, engines failing. Then a pause, followed by one final word, barely discernible through the storm's electric growl. Praying. No one on shore could answer. The telegraph lines along the coast were down, buried beneath ice and snapped poles. The message reached only fragments of its intended path, bouncing between stations before vanishing altogether. For the men aboard the Regina, there was no longer a world beyond their hull. They were alone in a white prison of wind and steel. Inside the wheelhouse, Captain Edward McConkie stood braced against the wall, the ship lurching beneath him like a struck bell. Every plate shuddered under the force of the waves, and the air smelled of burning oil and iron. The engines coughed, sputtered, then resumed, laboring as though each turn of the screw might be its last. McConkie wiped frost from the window, but there was nothing to see. The snow was solid, impenetrable. Even the lake had disappeared beneath it. Below deck, men baled water from the engine room, their boots sloshing in a rising tide of freezing brine. Steam hissed from cracked pipes, filling the corridor with a choking mist. They worked in silence, faces grey, movements slow from the cold. One of them, young Bill Fraser, barely 20, paused long enough to pull a photograph from his pocket. It was already wet, the faces blurred, but he tucked it back into his coat like a charm. "They'll see us through," he whispered. On deck, the snow fell so thick that the lifeboats vanished beneath it. Ice clung to every surface, coating ropes until they were rigid as iron rods. The storm howled with a sound that no man could describe, part wind, part voice. It came from everywhere, at once, rising and falling like some ancient chant. Men shouted to one another but could not hear their own words. When lightning flickered across the horizon, it was not white but green, staining the air like seawater caught on fire. At 8:17, the Regina rolled hard to port. Cargo shifted, water flooded through the ventilators, and for a terrible moment the ship hung there, tilted against the wind. The crews scrambled, cutting ropes, slamming bulkheads, shouting orders no one could follow. Then, with a grinding moan, she righted herself. A cheer went up, brief, desperate, human. It was the last sound of hope the storm would allow. At 8:29, a second message sputtered from the Regina's wireless, taking water fast. May not last an hour. The operator tapped out the words through shaking fingers, knowing even as he did that no one was listening. Outside, the deck vanished under the next wave. The lake rose higher, the wind screamed louder, and the ship that had once been called unsinkable began to die. When the storm finally swallowed her whole, it did so without ceremony. The radio fell silent, mid-transmission. The last spark blinked out, and the Regina, her crew, her captain, her prayers slipped beneath the waves. Far above, the wind moved on, indifferent, leaving only static on the air where voices had been. The Regina's last signal would never reach shore. It would drift, faint and eternal, through the storm's electric breath like a ghost still calling home. By the night of November 10th, the Great Lakes no longer had an edge. Shore and sea had become one endless sweep of darkness and white, an erasure of the world. To sailors, the horizon was everything, the one truth that divided the living from the depths. Now it was gone. The lakes had folded it away, drawing the ships deeper into blindness. Along the Canadian coast, the towns of Goderic, Kincardine, and Grand Bend had vanished under snowdrifts taller than wagons. People who lived near the water could no longer hear the waves, only the relentless scream of wind and the drumbeat of ice slamming against the shore. The lighthouses, those steadfast keepers of direction, were invisible, their beacons smothered by snow so thick it swallowed the light whole. The lighthouse at Point Clark burned its lamp until the glass cracked, and still no beam reached the water. Out on Lake Huron, Captain George Mackay of the Charles S. Price strained to see even the faintest glow of land. "It should be there," he muttered, his voice breaking the frost-heavy silence. "God help us, it should be there." But there was nothing, no light, no line of darkness to mark the coast. The storm had taken it all. His ship, once so proud and steady, was now a coffin carried by blind hands. The compass spun wildly, the wheel shuddered, every sound echoed wrong, distorted by the snow. The crew had long since stopped speaking. They moved like ghosts through corridors filled with vapor and noise, checking the hatches, securing the coal, fighting ice that grew faster than fire could melt it. The Price rose on one monstrous wave, then plunged into another. The engines groaned in agony. Men clung to each other in the dark, praying into the storm. The shore was only a word now, something remembered from another life. In Sarnia, families stood by frozen windows, staring toward the invisible lake. They knew their husbands, sons, and fathers were out there somewhere in the dark, but they could no longer tell where the water began. The blizzard made ghosts of the living and monuments of their houses. One woman, Mary O'Connell, lit 3 candles on her windowsill, one for her husband aboard the Regina, one for her brother on the Hydrus, and one for the nameless others who would never return. The flames burned steady for a moment, then bowed as the wind found the cracks in the glass. At Port Huron, the harbour itself disappeared. Snow piled into the slips until the outlines of ships were buried beneath white mounds. Ice formed along the wharves in thick ridges that cracked like gunfire. The storm had claimed not only the lake but the land itself. By midnight, the snow had become a solid wall, a moving curtain that devoured light. It hissed and screamed, driving into every crevice, filling every sound with itself. Captains who tried to steer toward what they thought was land only found more darkness, more water, more wind. The storm had erased the map, and every direction led back into its heart. Somewhere out there, the Charles S. Price kept her bow pointed toward where the shoreline should have been. Mackay stared into the blank whiteness until his eyes watered from the glare. He thought he saw something, a glimmer, a lantern, perhaps the promise of land. He ordered the engines forward, but what he saw was only lightning, silent and cruel, flashing across a sky that no longer had a horizon. And in that light, just for a heartbeat, he saw the truth. The lake had no shore anymore. There was only the storm, endless and alive, swallowing everything that once held shape. It was near dawn when the air itself seemed to shatter. The lake, the snow, the wind, everything that had been merely furious became something else entirely. Men later said the storm changed sound that hour. It stopped roaring and began breaking. The world above them cracked open, and the sky fell in pieces. Lightning flickered in slow motion through the snow, violet and green, illuminating brief flashes of chaos. A lifeboat torn from its davits, a man crawling across a frozen deck, a mast bowing like a reed before snapping in two. The thunder came late, deep and metallic, rolling through the ice-thick air like cannon fire. It didn't echo, it stayed, vibrating through bone and steel alike, as though the storm had found a voice and meant to use it. On the Hydrus, the sky collapsed first. The crew had been fighting to keep the intake valves clear when the first bolt struck the water. The explosion of steam blinded everyone on deck. "Get below!" the captain shouted, but the words vanished beneath the howl. Waves smashed over the bow with the force of falling buildings, and each one came higher, heavier. The air burned with ozone and saltless spray. Inside the ship's belly, the engineers tried to keep the pumps working as water poured through unseen seams. The gauge needles swung wildly, pressure, temperature, depth, all meaningless now. Aboard the Charles S. Price, Captain Mackay could no longer distinguish night from day. The storm had erased the sky entirely, and the world glowed with a sickly, colorless light that came from everywhere and nowhere. The ship rose on a crest so high that it felt like flight. For a few heartbeats, they looked down upon the storm itself. Then gravity reclaimed them. The fall lasted long enough for a man to pray twice. When the vessel hit bottom, the sound was not a crash, but a deep, booming crack, as though the hull had struck the earth itself. From shore, witnesses swore they saw the sky folding down onto the water clouds, so low they scraped the surface, mixing snow and spray into one seamless shroud. In Goderich, entire streets disappeared under white. Barns collapsed under the weight of ice. In Bayfield, the church steeple broke and tumbled into the drifts, its bell ringing once as it fell. People huddled by stoves, whispering that the sky had turned against them. Out at sea, the sailors understood that truth in their own way. The storm no longer moved across the lake, it was the lake. The waves and wind and lightning had become a single, writhing creature. Every crash of thunder sent tremors through the hulls. Snow fell upward as well as down, carried by eddies so violent that even gravity seemed confused. Men shouted without sound. One reached for the sky instinctively, trying to find where it had gone. At 7:40 a.m., a final bolt split the air above Lake Huron, bright enough to turn the whole storm white for an instant. For that one heartbeat, the men of the Regina, the Hydrus, and the Charles S. Price saw each other across the lake, tiny specks on a boiling plain of water. Then the light vanished, and the sky came down again, sealing them off forever. The storm had closed the world. There was no up, no down, no heaven left to look toward. Only the collapsing sky pressing everything, ship, man, and prayer, into the depths. By mid-morning on the 10th, the storm had matured into a monster so vast it seemed to swallow time itself. And yet, even as the wind tore steel apart and the snow turned daylight to blindness, not every captain fled. Some held their course, some believed their ships stronger than the storm, and some, bound by pride and cargo contracts, refused to turn back because the Great Lakes had taught them something cruel, that fortune belonged to the stubborn. Captain James Owen of the Wexford was one of those men. His ship, a sleek ore carrier out of Collingwood, had weathered storms before. He trusted her hull, trusted his crew, trusted his experience. "We'll make Goderich before noon," he said that morning, though the sea beyond the bow was already climbing like a living wall. Around him, the men said nothing. Their faces were grey with exhaustion, lips cracked from the cold. They had bailed, chipped, lashed, and prayed for 20 hours straight. But when the captain barked orders, they obeyed. There was no turning back on the Wexford. There never had been. Farther north, on the Henry B. Smith, the crew faced the same decision. The first mate, Charles Cates, begged the captain to take shelter at Whitefish Bay. "She's heavy, sir. She won't ride this one," he warned. The captain's answer was curt. "She'll ride it, because we will." The ship was loaded to the rails with ore, her decks nearly kissing the lake. Every wave that hit her now stayed with her, rolling along her spine until the entire hull trembled like a struck drum. But still they pressed on. To turn back meant admitting fear, and on these lakes, fear was a language no captain spoke aloud. In their silence, the storm found its rhythm. The wind no longer howled, it roared in long, measured breaths, each one stronger than the last. Waves rose high enough to blot out the sky, then crashed with a force that felt biblical. Crews lashed themselves to the rails, their fingers stiff and white from frostbite. Orders became gestures. Eyes met in fleeting glances that said what words could not. "We are not coming home." Back on land, the people who knew these captains waited for news. Wives stood on porches long past dark, watching lamps swing violently in the wind. Children listened for the whistle of returning ships, hearing only the moan of the storm. The docks were deserted, the telegraph silent. Yet the faith of those waiting was as unyielding as the pride of the men at sea. They believed in the ships, in the strength of the Great Lakes sailors, in the myth that no water could take a man who refused to yield. But myths are fragile things. Around noon, witnesses near Port Stanley claimed to see a black hull rise from the storm's belly, roll, and vanish. They thought it was a mirage. It wasn't. The Wexford had met her end. Others would follow before sunset. Still, some ships refused surrender. They turned their bows into the wind, engines screaming, as though defiance itself could outlast the storm. "We'll ride her out," Captain Mackay had said of the Charles S. Price. Now those same words echoed across the lake, repeated by men who would not yield to nature even as it consumed them. The storm did not punish them for their courage. It honored it, in its own merciless way. It took them quickly, cleanly, with no witnesses but the wind. And when the last of them went under, the waves folded over their graves as if closing a door. The men who wouldn't turn back were gone, but their stubbornness lingered, etched into the heartbeat of the storm itself. It would whisper through the rigging of future ships, reminding every sailor that sometimes courage is just another name for refusal, and that on the Great Lakes, refusal can be fatal. At 2:00 the afternoon, the Charles S. Price was still fighting, though fighting no longer meant steering or sailing, it meant existing one more minute. The storm had stripped away everything that made her a ship. Her decks were frozen, her compass spun like a child's toy, and her crew could not see beyond the next wave. The men had become shapes in the blur, hunched against the wind, their breath freezing before it left their mouths. Every sound was the same: water striking iron, ice splitting, bolts snapping. The ship moaned like a wounded creature, caught between air and abyss. Captain George Mackay stood in the wheelhouse, one hand gripping the frozen railing, the other clenched around his rosary. He had stopped giving orders hours ago. The lake had stopped listening. The Price was no longer responding to the rudder, and the storm had taken control of her fate. Each wave lifted her by the bow until she hung upright, then dropped her again, hammering her hull like an anvil. The lights flickered, dimmed, and died. The crew fought by lantern glow, pale faces reflecting flame and fear. Below deck, men struggled to pump out the water pouring in through ruptured seams. It was useless. The pumps froze, the handles jammed with slush. One engineer, frostbitten and delirious, began to laugh as he worked, his laughter swallowed by the storm. "She's a fine ship," he said to no one. "She'll right herself." But the Price was already dying. The cargo iron ore had shifted with the pounding of the waves, dragging her center of gravity lower with every hit. At 2:17 p.m., a monster wave struck from the starboard side. Witnesses onshore would later swear they saw it rise higher than the ship's mast, 60 feet at least, a wall of black and white that seemed to blot out the sky. It hit with the sound of a cannon blast. The Price rolled sharply to port, hesitated, then continued turning. For a brief moment, she lay on her side, her decks vertical, her masts parallel with the horizon. Men clung to whatever they could, rails, pipes, each other, as the world tilted beneath them. Then came the groan, deep, low, final, the sound of metal surrendering to water. The Charles S. Price rolled completely over. Her hull, painted black, gleamed wetly in the faint light as she capsized, trapping the men inside. Air rushed upward, carrying the screams of those still alive, until the lake swallowed everything. A final bubble broke the surface, then nothing. No wreckage, no debris. The Price vanished. Onshore, near Port Franks, two farmers had been walking the coast, heads bent against the wind, when they saw the impossible sight, a ship's dark belly floating upside down in the storm. They didn't know its name, only that no human sound came from it. They ran to the village to report what they'd seen, but no one believed them at first. "A ship can't float that way," said the harbour master. "Not on her back." But she did. For 2 days, the Price drifted that way, upturned, silent, black against the white waves like a tomb that refused to sink. When rescuers finally reached her on November 12th, they found her hull coated in ice, her propeller still visible above the waterline. No bodies, no names. The storm had taken all of them and left the Price as a warning, a ghost of iron and frost, proof that even steel could be humbled. In the weeks to come, she would be called the ship that wouldn't die. But those who saw her understood better. The Charles S. Price hadn't refused death. She had accepted it fully, rolling over to meet the lake face to face. And in that final act, she became a monument to the storm itself, unyielding, merciless, and terribly alive. When the Charles S. Price went under, the lake did not pause to mourn. It simply moved on, one wave rolling into another, one life folding into silence. By evening, every surviving ship was half entombed in ice. The decks had turned to glass, the rigging stiff as sculpture, the flags frozen solid mid-flutter. The storm's breath was colder now, sharper, its rage condensed into precision. It no longer howled wildly, it cut. On the Hydrus, Captain Rowan stood at the wheelhouse window, squinting into the blinding white. His gloved hands were fused to the helm with frost, the leather stiff, the fingers curved in permanent grip. He'd been standing there for hours, his eyes red-rimmed and raw from wind and ice. Each time a wave struck, the ship lifted and dropped like a thrown toy, and he leaned with it, instinctively, as if his body could will the ship to stay afloat. "She'll hold," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice was lost to the roar. "She has to hold." Below deck, the engineers worked in darkness. The generators had failed, leaving only the dull orange glow of lanterns swinging from pipes overhead. They were surrounded by the rhythm of disaster, the pounding of waves, the hissing of steam, the groan of bending steel. Each sound carried a question. How long until it breaks? Water seeped through cracks along the bulkhead, freezing as it entered, building walls of ice that crawled up from the floor. One man, delirious from cold, pressed his bare hand to the metal wall and left a patch of skin behind. He didn't scream, he just laughed, the sound thin and fragile as glass. On the upper deck, men tried to free the lifeboats, but the davits were sealed in ice thicker than their wrists. Axes broke against it, ropes snapped, they might as well have been chiseling marble. The storm had sculpted the Hydrus into a monument long before it meant to sink her. At 6:10 p.m., a rogue wave struck the port side. It came without warning, no crest, no rise, just a solid wall of water roaring out of the white. It hit with the weight of a building, sweeping half the deck crew overboard. The men vanished instantly, pulled under the freezing surface before anyone could cry out. For a few heartbeats, the sea glowed faintly from the lanterns torn free, their light bobbing beneath the waves before going dark. Captain Rowan didn't move. His hands were still on the wheel, frozen in place. The second mate touched his shoulder, shouting something about turning into the wind, but the captain couldn't hear. The cold had already taken him slowly, silently, as the storm raged around him. His eyes stared forward, unblinking, at nothing. When the Hydrus finally went down, she did so almost gracefully. The ice made her heavy, dragging her bow under first. Her stern rose like a final salute before vanishing. For hours afterward, pieces of her cargo timbers, barrels, a single oar washed ashore along the Huron coast. Fishermen who found them said the wood still burned their hands from cold. Days later, when divers searched the wreck, they found the wheel still upright, the captain's gloves still clinging to it. The hands within had long since frozen through. The wheel, though, hadn't moved, and perhaps it never would. When the storm finally began to loosen its grip, it did not stop, it merely grew tired. The wind fell from a scream to a growl, the snow slowed from fury to drift, and the waves, those monstrous walls of black water, slumped into grey exhaustion. By then, the damage was done. The Great Lakes lay bruised and littered, their rage spent, their silence now heavier than the noise that had come before. The living world waited for dawn to show what was left. On the morning of November 11th, the shoreline of Lake Huron looked like a battlefield. The beach at Goderich was buried under a quilt of wreckage timbers, lifeboats, coal, pieces of broken hulls painted in the colors of the lost. Masts jutted from the sand like crosses. Whole sections of ship cabins, torn free by the wind, lay half-buried in snowdrifts, their portholes staring blankly at the sky. People emerged from their homes in silence, the storm's ghost still humming in their ears. They walked among the debris with the storm, reverence of mourners at a graveyard. A fisherman named Robert Fielding was the first to find the body. It lay face down near the rocks, the man's coat frozen solid, his hand still gripping a splintered length of rope. The fisherman turned him over gently and saw that his eyes were open, filled with frost. By noon, they had found 3 more, one washed into the shallows, one tangled in netting, one half buried in sand. No one spoke as they gathered them, only crossed themselves before covering the faces. Farther up the coast near Kincardine, an overturned lifeboat lay like a shell. Inside it were 2 men locked together, their arms frozen around each other's shoulders. Their skin was white as chalk, their hair dusted with ice. A farmer and his sons dragged the boat inland with a team of horses. Behind them, the trail they left steamed faintly in the cold air. At Bayfield, children found fragments of the Wexford, a plank bearing the painted letters EX, a lantern still holding the ghost of its last flame. Women wept quietly as they collected what they could: a boot, a cap, a piece of wood small enough to carry. One mother thought she recognized her husband's coat lining inside the wreckage of a life preserver. She pressed it to her chest, as if warmth might return through memory. By afternoon, the beaches from Sarnia to Southampton were thick with death. The lake had given back what it could not keep. Reporters would later count 250 men lost in those 2 days, but those who walked the shoreline that morning knew the number was higher. Not all bodies wash ashore. Some the lake keeps forever. In the fading light, townsfolk gathered along the dunes to watch the waves still rolling in. The horizon glowed faintly with the first sunlight in 3 days. Between the white of the snow and the dull iron of the lake, wreckage glimmered like bones under shallow water. Someone began to ring the church bell, a single toll, slow and deliberate. It echoed down the coast, through the quiet streets, across the fields of ice. And though the storm was gone, the sound lingered, mixing with the whisper of the waves that had taken so much and given back only fragments. The lakes had exhaled. What they left behind was a shoreline of wreckage and silence. For 3 days, the storm had howled like something alive, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The quiet that followed felt unnatural, too heavy to trust. Across the small towns that hugged the Great Lakes, Goderich, Port Huron, Alpena, Bayfield, Collingwood, people stood in doorways and listened. The air was sharp, brittle, filled with the faint crackle of thawing ice. Smoke rose hesitantly from chimneys, curling into a sky the color of pewter. It was over, or so it seemed, but the silence had a weight to it, as though the storm had left its shadow behind. In Goderich, the church bells rang for the first time since the gale began. The sound carried strangely over the snow, dull and distant. Families emerged from their homes, wrapped in quilts and shawls, faces pale from sleepless nights. They walked to the shore in pairs, their boots crunching on ice-crusted snow, guided by curiosity and dread in equal measure. What they found was not the lake they had known. The harbor was gone, buried beneath slabs of ice as thick as tables. The water was still moving beneath, slow and dark, pushing up the wreckage of the storm, one piece at a time. In Alpena, a telegraph operator named Samuel Price sat at his desk, tapping out messages to nowhere. The lines had been dead since Saturday, and yet he sent his signals anyway, hoping that someone, somewhere, might still be listening. His fingers were cracked and bleeding, his coffee long frozen in its cup. Each click of the telegraph key echoed in the empty office like a heartbeat. Outside, the windows were frosted white, erasing the horizon. When the wind shifted, he thought he heard something faint, far off, a whistle maybe. He leaned close to the glass and whispered, "Who's there?" But it was only the sound of the ice shifting on the lake. At Port Huron, survivors' families gathered at the dock, eyes fixed on the water. They waited for ships that would never appear. Children held onto mothers' skirts, asking when they could go home. Some men tried to clear the harbor with poles, breaking ice from the mooring posts, as if doing so might summon the vessels back. Others stood motionless, their breath misting in the bitter air. They said nothing. There was nothing to say. The storm had stolen more than lives, it had stolen sound. The waves lapped faintly against the frozen shore, muted by ice. Even the gulls were gone. The only noise was the creak of trees shedding their coats of frost, the occasional distant crash of shifting icebergs colliding far offshore. It was a silence that pressed into the bones, that made even prayers seem too loud. That evening, when the first telegrams from Detroit arrived with lists of missing vessels, the townspeople gathered in the post offices and read the names aloud. Every name was familiar. Fathers, brothers, neighbors, sons. With each word, the silence deepened, as if the storm was still listening, still taking. In Bayfield, a woman named Clara Dalton lit a lantern and set it on her porch rail facing the lake. Her husband had been aboard the Hydrus. The light burned through the night, flickering in the wind, until morning turned it to smoke. Others followed her lead. Soon, from Sarnia to Thunder Bay, the coast shimmered with a chain of lanterns, small, trembling flames against the endless dark, and though no one said it aloud, everyone felt it that the storm, somehow, had not entirely gone. It lingered in the silence, in the still water, in the way the towns now listened differently to the wind. When the storm was at its height, the telegraph poles had bent like blades of grass. Now they stood broken, their wires tangled in the snowdrifts like veins torn from the earth. Across Michigan, Ontario, and Wisconsin, the Great Lakes lay mute 5 inland seas without a voice. The telegraph stations that once chattered endlessly with weather reports, ship positions, and coded chatter were silent now. In their absence, dread spread faster than any message ever could. At dawn, in the small Michigan town of Harbor Beach, the telegraph operator, a thin, gray-haired man named Edwin Morris, walked the tracks with a lantern to check the lines. He found splintered poles half buried in snow, wires frozen into whips of silver ice that hummed faintly in the wind. When he touched one, a static spark leapt to his glove. He jerked his hand back and listened. There was a faint sound in the distance, not quite a whistle, not quite a cry. The storm had left ghosts in the wires. For decades, the pond lakes had been alive with communication. Captains sent reports from ship to shore, coast guards relayed warnings, and harbor masters tracked the heartbeat of trade that kept whole cities alive. Now, after 48 hours of violence, that heartbeat had stopped. Messages sent before the lines failed hung somewhere between poles, half-formed sentences trapped in the ice, like prayers never delivered. In Sarnia, the telegraph station had turned into a vigil. Women gathered near the stove, clutching letters that had yet to be sent. They watched the operator work the dead key, tapping into silence as if persistence alone could conjure a reply. "Anything?" one woman asked. He shook his head. Nothing but the wind. The wires themselves groaned outside, stretching and tightening under the weight of ice until they sang low metallic notes that sounded almost human. In Cleveland, the Associated Press office tried all night to raise contact with the coastal towns. Their machines clicked, sparked, and stopped. No answer from Alpena, none from Port Huron, none from Tobermory. The operator muttered, "We're cut off." The editor, a man named Ransom Black, ran a hand over his face and stared out at the lake through the frosted window. "Then write this," he said quietly. "The lakes have gone silent. Along the Ontario shore, where the wrecks had begun to drift in, search parties waited for instructions that never came. Without the telegraph, rescue coordination was impossible. Men built signal fires on the dunes, sending up plumes of black smoke to mark where they had found debris. Across the lake, others answered with their own fires. The storm had broken the world into pieces, and now the survivors were trying to reassemble it one spark at a time. By nightfall, the silence became unbearable. People began to speak in whispers, as though their voices might disturb the sleeping dead beneath the waves. In the distance, where the last intact lines hung between poles, the wind strummed the wires in long, mournful tones. Farmers said it sounded like music. Others said it was the lake itself, trying to speak through what remained of the living world. And in a way, it did. The hum of frozen wires carried a rhythm that was not quite random, an echo of the signals that once pulsed through them, the staccato language of men now gone. Long, short, long. A faint SOS, playing itself out in the dark. The telegraph lines, dead and broken, were not truly silent. They were repeating the last thing they'd heard. When the storm finally passed, it did not bring relief. It brought the kind of stillness that felt wrong to breathe in. The sky cleared as if nothing had happened, pale and glassy above a horizon that glinted with frozen wreckage. In the towns that lined the Great Lakes, The people awoke to a silence they had never known before. There was no wind, no cry of gulls, no sound of ships' whistles echoing across the water. Only the slow, brittle crack of ice thawing in the morning light. In Port Huron, Mary O'Connell rose from a night without sleep. Her husband, Patrick, had been a deckhand aboard the Regina. She had listened through the storm for the sound of her husband's whistle, their signal when his ship was near, but only the storm answered. When the wind stopped, she still imagined hearing it in the distance. That morning, she wrapped herself in his wool coat and walked down to the pier, each step sinking into snow that reached her knees. The town was unrecognizable. The once bustling dockyards were now wastelands of ice. Crates and barrels were frozen into place mid-tumble. Ropes stretched stiff between posts, and whole fishing boats lay half-buried under snow. The lake had risen onto the land, leaving a skin of frost that glimmered like glass over everything it touched. Mary stopped at the water's edge, where the ice met the air in a jagged line. She could see something far out, something dark, maybe a buoy, maybe more wreckage. She didn't move closer. She just stood there, waiting. In other homes, other widows were doing the same. They poured coffee that went untouched, laid out breakfast for men who would never return, folded coats and gloves still damp from their last morning's work. Children were hushed. No one dared to break the silence that seemed to cover the whole town like snow. In Goderich, a woman named Eliza May lit every lamp in her house and kept them burning all day. "He'll find his way home if there's light," she whispered, though the lake outside was brighter than any lamp could ever be. As the morning wore on, men from the harbor patrol returned from their first search. They came quietly, without words, their faces gray. Their sleighs carried more than driftwood this time. Each bundle was wrapped in canvas, tied with rope. The sound of hooves crunching on ice was followed by the creak of wood as they unloaded their burden. No one asked who they had found. They all knew that by evening, every name would be spoken anyway. In Sarnia, church bells began to toll. Slow, one for each ship confirmed lost. The air filled with the sound, measured, relentless, impossible to ignore. Windows opened. People stepped out into the street and looked toward the water, listening. The bells did not stop for an hour. By the time they fell silent, the sun had dipped behind a veil of grey, and the townspeople returned indoors as if the cold itself had grown unbearable. Mary O'Connell stayed by the lake until dusk. She did not weep. She simply sat on an overturned barrel, her hands clasped tightly around her husband's scarf. Somewhere under that vast sheet of ice, she believed, his ship was resting quiet, still, at peace. But when the wind picked up again, brushing snow off the rails, it carried a sound like the faraway call of a horn, and for a moment, just one brief, merciful moment, Mary lifted her head and smiled, thinking she heard him coming home. Not every sailor went to the bottom. A few, fewer than a dozen, stumbled from the lake that week, half-blind, frostbitten, and mute. They came ashore in ones and twos, like men returned from another world. The storm had not spared them. It had merely allowed them to crawl free. No one ever knew how many tried to follow. On the evening of November 12th, the first of them appeared near Lexington, Michigan. Two fishermen searching the shoreline for wreckage spotted a figure moving through the snow, hunched and slow. At first, they thought it a trick of light, a coat blown loose, or driftwood upright in the wind. But then it moved again, staggering toward the dunes. When they reached him, they found a man whose face was swollen and raw, his eyelashes crusted with salt and ice. His lips moved, but only one word came through: Price. He was a fireman from the Charles S. Price, his name later given as Walter Sloan. His hands were blue, his ears black at the edges, and the skin on his palms had sloughed away from cold. They carried him to town on a sled, covering him in blankets, while he mumbled pieces of sentences about a sound like thunder, about light from below the waves, about hands on the ceiling. The doctors said he was delirious, that no one could survive 40 hours in that water. But he had, barely. Farther north, near Bayfield, 2 more men crawled from the wreck of a capsized lifeboat. They were from the Wexford. One had lost his boots and was walking on feet the color of wax. The other had frost on his beard so thick it looked like snow was growing from his skin. They reached a farmhouse at dawn and collapsed in the doorway. The farmer's wife screamed when she saw them, thinking they were ghosts come to claim the living. When they spoke, their voices were faint, thin as paper tearing. She rolled, one said, didn't come back up. The survivors did not remember how they made it ashore. Some said they followed the lights of a distant town, others that they woke already on the beach. A few confessed to hearing voices in the storm, women calling them by name, leading them home. The priests in Port Huron called it mercy. The doctors called it delirium. The sailors, when they recovered enough to speak, called it the lake's decision. Word of the living spread fast. Families filled the hospitals, clutching photographs, begging to see the rescued men. But the survivors barely recognized anyone. Their eyes were glassy, their skin white as candle wax. Some stared through the visitors as though still watching the storm. They were haunted men, caught between worlds, too alive for the dead, too broken for the living. In the days that followed, snow buried the tracks they had made from the water. The wind smoothed the dunes, erasing their path. Only their stories remained told in low voices around kitchen tables and in church basements. Stories of waves that rose like mountains, of ships breaking in two, of men who drowned standing up. And somewhere out there, on nights when the fog rolls in thick over Lake Huron, people swear they still see them, the men who walked out of the snow wandering the shoreline with eyes like frost, looking for the ships that never came home. The storm had taken what it wanted. Then, as if satisfied, it left behind its calling card ice. Not the thin, delicate frost of winter's beginning, but thick slabs of frozen history that stretched across the Great Lakes like glass tombstones. The wind had stilled, but its memory lingered in every frozen wave, each one curved mid-crash, suspended in motion. In the pale light of dawn, the lakes looked like they'd been stopped mid-breath. On Lake Huron, the ice extended for miles, its surface cracked into jagged plates. Beneath it, the water still moved slowly, black and heavy, carrying its burden of wrecks and men. Fishermen who dared to walk out onto the frozen shallows claimed they could hear it, the faint knock of wood against metal, the distant clink of a chain still moving in the depths. "The lake's talking," one old man said. "She's telling us who she took." Along the Ontario coast, the search parties began their grim work. Men trudged across the ice with pikes and ropes, their boots echoing on the frozen surface. They scanned for anything oil slicks, floating debris, a scrap of painted wood. Each time they found something, they stopped and knelt, chipping it free from the ice with hammers. A nameplate here, a lifebuoy there. One man found a child's photograph sealed inside a waterproof tin, the face smiling up at him through a thin sheen of frost. He didn't open it. He just placed it on the nearest snowbank and bowed his head. In Goderich, the harbor froze solid overnight. The masts of shattered boats protruded from the ice like grave markers. Townsfolk began calling it the cemetery, and the name stayed. Families came to the shoreline each morning, walking slowly among the wreckage, searching for pieces of their own. They left flowers in the snow, candles that flickered briefly before the cold snuffed them out. Beneath the frozen water, the wrecks lay eerily preserved. Divers wouldn't find them for decades, but the lake knew exactly where each one rested. The Regina, the Hydrus, the Wexford, the Argus, the Price, their names whispered across the frozen plains of the Great Lakes that winter. When the wind blew from the north, the ice cracked with a deep, mournful groan, and the people in the towns along the shore would stop what they were doing to listen. They said it was the sound of the ships shifting below, the lake turning in its sleep. In Bayfield, a boy named Samuel found a pocket watch frozen into a sheet of ice near the breakwater. Its glass face was cracked, its hands stopped forever at 4:17. The boy's father told him to leave it be, but Samuel chipped it free anyway and kept it in his coat pocket. For years, it ticked faintly on cold nights, though no one ever wound it. The ice stayed for months, refusing to release its dead. Even as spring approached, it held tight, glinting with the faint shimmer of things trapped inside ropes, beams, torn fabric. The people began to say the ice had a memory. It kept the storm alive, replaying the violence in frozen fragments each time the sun touched it. And when at last the thaw came, the lake sighed. The ice cracked open like an old wound, spilling its secrets one by one. Bodies, timber, tools, boots, and then nothing, only water again. Smooth, indifferent, quiet. But those who had stood there through that long, unending winter swore they could still see the faces beneath the surface, pale and motionless, staring up through the melting ice. The lake had let go of its wreckage, yes, but not its memory. The ice had remembered everything. When the wind finally died and the lake began to breathe again, the men came. They arrived in sleds and wagons from every nearby town, farmers, fishermen, dockworkers, even a few surviving sailors who could not bear to stay home while their comrades lay somewhere beneath the waves. They came carrying ropes, axes, shovels, and a kind of quiet resolve that only grief can forge. The storm had ended, but its silence demanded answers. The ice along the Ontario coast was jagged and grey, pressed into uneven ridges by the wind's retreat. The water beyond it looked calm, deceptive, a black mirror stretching to the horizon. The searchers spread out in pairs, testing the ice with long poles as they moved. Each crack beneath their boots sent a tremor through their hearts. Somewhere below that frozen skin lay ships the size of cathedrals, whole worlds swallowed in a single night. At Goderich, the first team set out before sunrise. Their leader, a harbour pilot named Thomas Keane, had lost his brother on the Wexford. He said little, only nodded when others spoke to him. The men followed him out across the bay, dragging a wooden sled loaded with coils of rope and a single grappling hook fashioned from an old anchor. The wind stung their eyes, and their breath hung thick in the air, drifting like smoke from ghosts. They searched for hours, calling out names into the empty expanse as though the lake might answer. Sometimes it did. A piece of timber would surface, rolling slowly in the current. A boot, a broken lantern. Once, a frozen hand, pale, unblemished, reaching upward through the thin ice. The men stopped, removed their caps, and worked in silence to free it. They carried what they found back to shore on the sled, not speaking until the work was done. In Port Huron, the U.S. Life-Saving Service launched its first post-storm patrol. The men moved along the coast in pairs, armed with telescopes and sketch pads. They drew what they saw, marking each wreckage field like doctors charting a wound. The beach was littered with the storm's remains, shattered hulls, crates of grain split open and frozen solid, barrels turned to drums of ice. Near the lighthouse, they found a lifeboat upside down, half buried in snow. Inside were 3 bodies, their faces peaceful, their hands still gripping the oars. The captain's whistle hung around one man's neck. When they blew it, no sound came out. By the 3rd day, the shoreline from Sarnia to Alpena had become a corridor of search parties. Families walked alongside rescuers, scanning every object that washed ashore, whispering prayers over things they recognized: a button, a nameplate, a familiar boot. For many, that was all they would ever recover. At night, the men built fires along the beach, small circles of warmth in the vast dark. They sat around the flames and stared out toward the black lake, listening to the faint crackle of ice. Every now and then, one would rise and shine his lantern toward the horizon, half hoping, half dreading that it might reflect on something moving. But nothing ever did. The Great Lakes had claimed their dead and buried them in silence. The searchers kept coming back anyway, day after day, as if by standing on the frozen edge they could undo what the storm had written. And when they finally went home, boots heavy with ice, and hearts heavier still, They left their fires burning behind them, tiny beacons along the shore, trembling in the wind like candles at a wake. From a distance, those flickering flames looked like eyes staring out across the lake, watching, waiting, searching still. By the time the searchers realized how vast the tragedy truly was, the lake had already sealed its dead beneath a skin of new ice. The survivors on shore spoke of it with reverence and fear, how the water had quieted too suddenly, how the surface lay unnaturally smooth, as though the Great Lakes themselves were trying to hide what they'd done. Beneath that silence lay a graveyard the size of a kingdom. Ships and men, dreams and cargo, all buried in the same cold dark. The first divers came weeks later, when the ice began to thin near the harbors. They were not the deep-sea professionals of later years, but working men, salvagers and fishermen with nerves hardened by poverty and loss. Their suits were crude, thick rubber coated in tar, their helmets bronze and heavy, connected to the surface by hoses and hand pumps. The water was black as tar, the temperature just above freezing. Yet they volunteered. They had brothers down there. In Goderich, the ice cracked open near the wreck of the Regina. A small salvage crew lowered a diver named Angus Delaney into the water. On shore, men turned the pumps slowly, forcing air into his lungs. The lake accepted him without ceremony. He descended into a darkness so absolute it seemed alive. Every beam of his lantern dissolved within inches, revealing only flashes, chains, ropes, fragments of a hull coated in ice. Then his boots struck metal. When Delaney reached the wreck, he could feel it more than see it. The Regina lay half buried in the silt, her bow twisted like a broken arm. The windows of her pilot house were shattered inward. He crawled along her deck, feeling his way through snow-like sediment until his glove brushed something soft, a sleeve. Then another. The bodies were still there, preserved by the cold, floating upright as though still at their posts. One hand, he swore later, still gripped the rail. They brought up only a few remains that day. The water had turned against them. A sudden current tugged at the 12 hoses, nearly dragging the diver off the wreck. The men on the surface hauled him back, his face pale and eyes wide behind the glass. When he spoke, his voice trembled. "They're standing," he said. "All of them. Waiting." Word spread quickly. The newspapers called the lake a mass tomb. But for those who lived on its shores, it became something more sacred, a cathedral of the drowned. Each ship was an altar. Each crew, a congregation held forever in silence. In Port Huron, a minister named Reverend Pike held a service for the buried fleet. He stood on the frozen pier in a black coat, his breath clouding the air. Around him, hundreds gathered, heads bowed against the cold. He read from the book of Psalms, "They that go down to the sea in ships, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep." His voice carried faintly across the still water. Some said it echoed. That night, a light appeared on the lake, a soft, bluish glow far out on the horizon, rising from where the Regina was believed to rest. No one could explain it. Some said it was gas from the wrecks, others that it was nothing more than moonlight breaking through cloud. But to those who saw it, it looked like lanterns. Hundreds of them. And for the first time since the storm, the people on shore began to weep, not from fear, but because it seemed the dead were answering. Weeks after the storm, when the winds had softened and the ice began to crack into grey plates along Lake Huron's rim, the searchers found their way to the waters off Port Huron. The newspapers had already listed the Hydrus and the John A. McGean as missing, presumed lost. But the lake, it seemed, was not content to keep them hidden forever. It began with a rumor, a fisherman who claimed to have seen a dark shape beneath the ice, long and curved, like a sleeping whale. Then came another report, this time from the crew of a tugboat cutting a channel through the thaw. They had struck something solid, metal. Within days, search teams gathered near the coordinates, lowering iron poles through cracks in the ice to measure the depth. When one pole struck steel and echoed hollowly upward, the men fell silent. They had found the Hydrus. On the morning of November 28th, divers went down. The water was bitterly cold. turning the lantern flames to halos before swallowing them whole. The Hydrus lay upright, eerily preserved, her hull coated with frost. The current was so still it seemed afraid to move. Inside the bridge, everything was in its place, the wheel, the compass, even the captain's coat hanging on its peg. But when the diver turned, his light fell on something that made him freeze. There, still standing behind the helm, was Captain Rowan. His gloves were fused to the wheel. The lake had kept him exactly as it had found him, steady, resolute, unblinking. In the engine room below, men were still at their posts. Their faces had the calm of statues, their tools frozen mid-task. The diver surfaced with trembling hands and refused to go back down. "They're waiting," he whispered. "The whole crew's waiting." The search team made the sign of the cross, then marked the spot with a buoy before the ice closed again that night. Farther south, off Harbour Beach, the John A. McGean was discovered 3 days later. She had gone down hard, bow first, with such force that her decks had split like ribs. When the first divers reached her, they found her cargo of iron ore still intact, glittering under the lantern beams like a field of stars. In the captain's cabin, the logbook was found half open, the last entry dated November 9th. Wind rising from the northwest, heavy snow, course steady. The ink had bled into the paper, the words vanishing where the pen had lifted for the final time. By December, both ships had become legends. The townspeople spoke of them in the same breath, two sister graves lying not far apart, their crews entombed in the same stretch of silent water. Families travelled from across the Great Lakes to stand on the shore nearest to where they rested. Some threw wreaths into the current, others whispered their sons' and husbands' names to the wind. One night, a farmer driving his wagon along the frozen bluff swore he saw two shapes in the distance, long, black silhouettes gliding parallel, under the ice, lanterns glowing faintly at their bows. When he blinked, they were gone, swallowed by the moonlight and the mist. He said nothing for years, but when he finally told the story, his voice shook. They weren't drifting, he said. They were sailing, side by side, like they'd finally found each other again. And perhaps they had, for even the lake seemed to quiet around that patch of water afterward, as though the storm itself had paused to remember the Hydrus and the John A. McGean, two iron ghosts, bound forever beneath the frozen skin of the Great Lakes. After the storm, the mail clerks worked with their coats on. The post offices of Sarnia, Cleveland, and Duluth smelled of damp canvas, coal, and salt. Bags of waterlogged letters were dragged in from wreckage and the beaches, frozen together in great clumps like barnacles. Each sack told a story that had never been delivered. Each letter was a voice that had spoken too late. The first bundle came from the shore near Kincardine, washed in with driftwood and tangled rope. Inside were dozens of envelopes marked with the same ship's name, Wexford. They had been sealed in wax, the handwriting still visible under the frost. Postal workers laid them out on tables by the stove, peeling them apart gently with gloved hands. As the paper thawed, the ink began to run, bleeding into blue veins across the pages. Words blurred, sentences vanished mid-thought. The storm had edited them mercilessly. A clerk named Ellen Bartlett took her time with each one. She read what fragments remained aloud, her voice soft and measured. "We make port tomorrow. Tell the children the lake's calm as glass today." Each phrase ended in silence. Around her, the other workers kept their heads down. No one wanted to cry in front of their colleagues. Not here. Not surrounded by so much loss that still had addresses attached. In Detroit, a crate of letters from the Regina was recovered, found trapped in the wreck's forward mailroom when the divers went down. They were perfectly preserved in waxed canvas pouches, unopened for weeks after the lake had claimed them. When officials finally pried the crate open, they found messages from businessmen, soldiers, newlyweds. One was a postcard from a young sailor to his sister in Buffalo. The handwriting was playful, confident. "We'll be home by Monday. I'll bring the snow with me." The ink had frozen mid-stroke, the line unfinished. News spread quickly of the recovered mail. Families lined up outside post offices, clutching identification papers, hoping one of the lost letters belonged to them. For many, it was the last piece of their loved ones they would ever hold. When the clerks read names aloud, women stepped forward with shaking hands, pressing damp envelopes to their hearts before they even opened them. Some letters were illegible, but it didn't matter. The weight of the paper was proof enough. A few envelopes were never claimed. They bore only initials or smudged return addresses, the lake having erased all trace of sender and recipient alike. Those were gathered and sealed again, placed into a single cedar box lined with linen. The clerks called it the drawer for the forgotten. It sat in the Sarnia post office for decades, unopened. Every so often, when the snow howled against the windows, Ellen Bartlett would find herself listening to the sound of paper shifting in that drawer. She swore it rustled sometimes, as if the letters were still trying to be read. And in a way, they were. For each page that blurred in the thaw, for every word that melted back into the silence of the storm, another name was remembered, not in ink, but in the act of looking, in the fingers that touched the paper, in the hearts that still waited for a message that would never come. The Great Lakes had taken their voices, but through the letters never sent, the dead found one last way to speak. By early December, the lake had grown still again, its fury buried beneath a crust of ice that stretched far into the horizon. But even in its stillness, it continued to return what it could not keep. Wreckage came first: planks, barrels, boots, pieces of railings. Then, slowly, the dead. Some were carried ashore gently, as if placed there by unseen hands. Others arrived half buried in snow, their bodies preserved in the same cold perfection that had taken them. On the morning of December 4th, a fisherman named Harold Keating was walking the beach near Goderich when he saw something upright in the ice. At first, he thought it a piece of driftwood or a marker stake lodged in the frozen sand, but as he drew closer, the shape took form: a man, standing waist-deep in the snow, encased in a column of ice that glinted like glass. His posture was calm, almost dignified, one arm resting against a jagged boulder, as if to steady himself. The ice had caught him mid-motion, preserving him, not as a corpse, but as an image of quiet endurance. Harold called for help, and soon half the town gathered along the beach. The men chipped carefully around the figure, revealing details that made the crowd fall silent. The man's face was pale and smooth, his eyes half closed, his lips slightly parted as though caught in the middle of a sigh. His clothes were ordinary: a woolen coat, thick trousers, work gloves, a leather apron frozen tight across his chest. In one gloved hand he still held a pair of cobbler's shears, their blades rusted shut. Someone recognized him almost immediately. His name was Thomas Reed, a local shoemaker. He'd been hired that season to repair boots for a crew on the Wexford. When the storm hit, he'd been seen near the docks, trying to help secure crates before the waves came in. No one knew how he'd ended up back at the water's edge, or how the lake had chosen to return him this way. They carried him to the town hall, still frozen, and laid him upright in a wooden crate filled with straw. For a week, people came to see him. They whispered prayers, left candles, and some brought pairs of worn shoes to place beside the box, a silent offering to the man who had once kept the town walking through its harshest winters. Children were told to be quiet in his presence. The ice around him never seemed to melt, not even by the fire's warmth. When at last the ground thawed enough to dig, they buried Thomas Reed in the churchyard overlooking the lake. His tools went with him: the shears, the awl, the hammer. The townsfolk built a small marker carved with the words, "He returned standing." Long after, on cold mornings, the people of Goderich would swear they could hear a faint tapping in the still air, the rhythmic sound of a hammer striking leather, steady and patient. The shoemaker, they said, was still at work, and when the snow came in from the lake, curling white over the town's rooftops, the ice around his grave would glisten longer than anywhere else, as though remembering the day the lake gave him back whole, unbowed, and frozen in time. Atop the frozen cliffs of Point Clark stood the lighthouse, tall, pale, and stoic, its glass crown veiled with frost. For days during the storm, its beam had been invisible, smothered by snow thick enough to swallow the light whole. When the winds calmed, the keeper, Thomas Adams, climbed the spiral stairs to relight it, though no ships remained to see. He moved slowly, each step echoing up through the hollow tower, the sound lonely and deliberate. Thomas had kept the Point Clark light for 17 years. He had watched hundreds of ships cross that narrow blue distance between Huron and the horizon, bright specks by day, stars by night. He knew their captains by name, their timetables by heart, their whistles by tone. The Hydrus, the Wexford, the Regina, the Charles S. Price, all familiar silhouettes once upon a calmer season. Now their names lived only in the wind. When he reached the top, the lens stood fractured. The storm had forced ice through the seams of the glass, splitting it like a spider's web. He cleaned it as best he could, chipping away frozen crusts with a hammer. His breath clouded the air, turning each exhale into fog. When he finally managed to light the lamp again, its beams swept across the lake, a weak, trembling column of gold that cut through mist and memory both. He watched it turn for a long time. Below him, the shoreline was a graveyard. From his tower, he could see what others could not. The patterns of wreckage marked into the snow like handwriting. Planks, barrels, bodies, ropes, each left where the waves had placed them. To him, it looked like script, something meant to be read. That night, after he descended the stairs, he sat at his desk and opened his logbook. He began writing as always, neat cursive lines in black ink. November 9th, heavy winds from the northwest. Snowfall increasing. Visibility nil. November 10th, barometer falling. Entire horizon white. Sound of surf now a roar. November 11th, no signals. No light but the storm itself. Wires dead. November 12th, shore covered in wreckage. Multiple dead recovered. Names unknown. Then he hesitated, pen suspended. The lamplight flickered over the page. His hand shook slightly. He began a new line, writing slower this time, as though uncertain what language could describe what he'd seen. November 13th. The lake has changed. Its surface moves like breathing. When the ice cracks, it sounds like voices. I lit the lamp, but I believe it is no longer for the living. He paused, listening. The sound of shifting ice drifted faintly through the walls, a deep, resonant tone that might have been the lake speaking, or perhaps the wind remembering. He closed the book, then reopened it, flipping back to the first page. Years of careful entries stared up at him, records of ships safe and storms survived. He took up his pen once more and added one last line beneath them all, simple and final. November 14th, wind calm, water still, too still, nothing left but the light. When they found Thomas Adams the next morning, he was seated at his desk, the logbook open before him, the ink still wet. The lamp above the tower burned steadily, its beam sweeping over a lake that would never again need its guidance. And on the final page, below the last neat entry, someone, perhaps his trembling hand, perhaps something else, had written a single word, repeated again and again down the margin, pressed deep enough to scar the paper. Wind, wind, wind. The first Sunday after the storm dawned clear and cruelly bright. The snow that had buried the towns now glittered in sunlight, every flake sharp as glass. Bells began to ring up and down the coast, slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure that sound could still exist after such silence. From Goderich to Alpena, from Bayfield to Port Huron, people gathered in their churches, their boots leaving dark puddles on the floor as they thawed. The air smelled of wet wool, smoke, and salt, the salt not from the sea, but from their tears. At St. Andrews in Goderich, Reverend Pike stood before a congregation that overflowed into the aisles. His voice trembled when he began the service. "We come together," he said, "to remember those the lake has taken." The words echoed through the stone nave. fading into the rafters like the last cries of gulls. There was no choir that morning, no organ, only silence, and the occasional muffled sob. He read from the book of Psalms, "They that go down to the sea in ships, these see the works of the Lord, and his wonders in the deep." But his voice broke midway, and he lowered the Bible, pressing a hand over his eyes. Someone in the back began to hum a hymn under their breath, soft, unsteady, and soon others joined in. The sound grew like a tide, fragile but persistent. In Sarnia, the church of Street, Peter's had draped its altar in black cloth. Dozens of candles burned on every surface, their flames flickering with every draught that slipped in from the door. Women placed photographs along the pew rails, husbands, sons, brothers, faces, smiling forever in uniforms and work clothes. Children sat beside them, clutching gloves or caps recovered from the wreckage. The priest spoke gently, but no one truly listened. Their attention was fixed on the lake, visible through the frosted windows, grey and endless, as if waiting for another sign, another voice. In Alpena, a widow named Margaret Delaney knelt through the entire service, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles bled. Her husband, Angus, had been one of the divers who'd found the Regina. He hadn't spoken after that dive, only stared at the horizon until the night he walked into the snow and never returned. When the priest asked the congregation to pray for the dead, she whispered, "And for those they called back with them." Every church had its own story that morning. In Bayfield, the pastor read the names of the lost from a list so long his voice began to crack before he finished. In Port Huron, mourners brought jars of lake water to pour into the baptismal font, turning it cloudy with sand and memory. The bells outside rang between services, their notes warped by the cold air, until every sound in town became an echo of the metal on wind, sorrow on sorrow. By midday, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass had turned the pews into pools of color, reds, blues, and golds dancing across the bowed heads of the grieving. It should have been beautiful, but it felt almost cruel. The light, like the storm, seemed indifferent. When the final hymn ended, no one moved to leave. They sat in the stillness, listening to the hiss of the candles and the faint groan of ice shifting somewhere far beyond the church walls. Then, as if guided by one thought, people began to rise. One by one, they stepped outside into the blinding brightness, carrying with them flowers, photographs, bits of wreckage, tokens of memory to lay by the shore. The lake waited for them, calm now, almost serene. But as the wind picked up, it carried a faint taste of salt, strange for fresh water, yet unmistakable. Some swore it was the sea itself that had come to mourn with them. Others said it was the storm, weeping its last. Either way, the air that Sunday was heavy with both grief and salt proof that sorrow, like the lake, could never truly dry. In the second week of December, when the lake finally stopped giving back its dead, a new kind of visitor appeared in the harbour towns. They came not with wreaths or prayers, but with ledgers, pens, and cold, deliberate eyes. The insurance men had arrived. They stepped off trains in their long grey coats, their breath fogging the air as they adjusted their hats and pulled leather briefcases close. They did not look at the lake, most avoided it altogether. To them, the storm was no longer a tragedy. It was an equation, a storm of statistics. Tonnage lost, cargo destroyed, premiums paid, lives converted into numbers and columns that could balance. Their work was simple: assess, record, and calculate. But to those still grieving, their presence felt like desecration. At the Goderich Hotel, the men set up in the parlour with stacks of papers and brandy to keep the chill away. They summoned ship owners, dockmasters, and widows alike. One by one, they asked questions in their clipped, professional tones. When was the last correspondence with your husband's vessel? What was the declared cargo weight? Were there any defects in the hull? The widows struggled to answer. Some stared blankly, some wept, some stormed out. The clerks continued to write, unmoved. In Sarnia, a representative from the Lake Carriers Association toured the frozen docks, counting ships that would never sail again. He made notes about salvage value and coal prices, dictating in a voice so flat it might as well have belonged to a machine. Behind him, children watched from alleyways, their small hands buried in their pockets. One boy threw a snowball at the man's polished boots. It struck cleanly and left a smear of grey slush. The man didn't turn. He only said, "This will cripple shipping for a season," as though speaking to no one. At the office of the Great Lakes Mutual, telegraph lines now restored, reports flowed in daily. Regina, total loss. Charles S. Price, total loss. Hydrus, total loss. Wexford, total loss. Each entry was followed by figures and signatures, neat and final. To the companies, these were closures. To the people of the lakes, they were funerals written in ink. Newspapers printed the numbers proudly. $50 million in damages, 18 ships destroyed, 250 souls lost. But in the homes lining the coast, the figures made no sense. How do you measure the worth of a man's last breath, or the way a wife waits each evening without striking a match for her lamp? In one office, a clerk named Harold Benton found himself staring at a claim form for a sailor named Patrick O'Connell. The policy was small, just enough for burial and a widow's stipend. At the bottom, he was meant to write, "Paid in full." His pen hovered over the paper. Outside the window, the lake glimmered under a crust of ice. For a long time, he couldn't move. Then, quietly, he closed the ledger. When night fell, the insurance men retired to their hotel rooms, satisfied that their work was nearly done. In the hallway, one of them paused by a frosted window and looked toward the black stretch of water in the distance. The wind moaned softly through the glass, carrying with it the faint echo of a ship's whistle, low, mournful, almost human. He listened for a moment, then turned away, telling himself it was only the wind. But as he left, the sound grew louder, following him down the corridor, as though the dead themselves were asking for one last correction in the ledger. That winter, the claims were all settled. The books balanced perfectly, but the air around the Great Lakes never did. When the storm finally gave way to calm and the bodies began to wash ashore, another kind of witness arrived, men with cameras. They came with their heavy tripods and glass plate lenses, the kind used for weddings and parades, now repurposed for ruin. The newspapers had sent them from Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto, eager to capture what words could not: the scale of the Great Lakes disaster. The photographers stepped gingerly along the frozen beaches, their boots crunching on ice, the wind snapping at their dark coats. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence of the scene spoke louder than anything they could have said. Their first stop was Godderish, where the wreckage of the Wexford had begun to drift ashore. The men carried their cameras like sacred instruments, positioning them carefully beside the debris planks, barrels, and the shattered remains of lifeboats. One man, a young photographer named William Garrick, removed his hat and stared at a child's shoe, lying half buried in snow. He did not photograph it. Some things, he said later, were too loud for silence. The glass plates caught what the human mind could not process in motion. Ships capsized and torn open like carcasses, piers sheathed in inches of ice, the icicles hanging from their railings like teeth. Lifeboats turned belly up on the sand, filled with frozen water instead of men. A gull stood on the gunwale of one, crying once before flying off. Garrick raised his camera. The lens blinked. Time stopped again, the shutter freezing not just the moment but the cold breath of it. In Port Huron, the photographers found the upturned hull of the Charles S. Price, the infamous ship that wouldn't sink. She lay black and immense against the white horizon, a mountain of iron and grief. The men worked quickly, knowing the light would fade soon. They took photographs from every angle, their boots slipping on the icy ground. "Look at her," one muttered, his voice hollow. "She's like a gravestone." The local paper would later publish the images, titling them "Tragedy on the Inland Seas." The photographs traveled from city to city, displayed in shop windows and train stations, drawing crowds who gawked in silence. People pointed, whispered, wept. For many, it was the first time they understood the storm's true power. But for the photographers, the work left an invisible frost that never melted. Garrick stopped eating for days after developing the plates, the ghostly faces that appeared in the fog of his darkroom haunting him long after the chemicals cleared. "It's as if they're still moving," he said to his assistant, "like the water hasn't let them go." Back on the frozen shore, one of the older photographers, a man named Claude Heron, lingered after the others packed their gear. The sun was setting over the lake, and for a moment the ice caught the light in shades of gold and red, beautiful and terrible. He took one last photograph, no wreckage, no bodies, just the horizon and the reflection of his own shadow on the snow. Years later, when that final plate was found in his trunk after his death, the image revealed something strange. In the lower corner, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a figure standing at the water's edge. Its face was turned toward the lake, blurred by motion, as if walking slowly into the light. Some said it was a trick of exposure. Others said it was the lake itself, caught looking back. By the end of November, the presses thundered louder than the waves. In every city from Milwaukee to Toronto, newspaper headlines screamed in tall, black letters that seemed to stretch across continents. Lake Huron Cemetery, fleet lost 200 dead. The ink bled through the paper, staining fingers and breakfast tables, as if grief itself had seeped into the print. The Great Lakes, once a symbol of progress and pride, had turned into an open grave, and the world wanted to read every detail. In Cleveland, the Plain Dealer devoted its entire front page to the tragedy. The photographs filled the margins, ships overturned, lighthouses glazed in ice, widows in black veils standing by the shore. One article described the storm as a visitation of divine wrath, while another insisted it was merely the price of industry. The contradiction didn't matter. The readers devoured it all. In Chicago, journalists interviewed survivors whose words trembled on the page. Lake rose like a wall. The sky fell on us. Men were swept into nothing. Their statements were printed alongside drawings of waves taller than houses, and ships cracked in two like toys. The public read, gasped, and kept turning the pages. Mourning had become morning news. At the Associated Press office in Detroit, telegraph lines clattered again for the first time since the storm. Reporters leaned over desks, writing furiously by lamplight. Some wept without realizing it, their eyes watering from fatigue and smoke. Every detail was catalogued: dates, times, names, weather readings, fragments of last words. The facts came in like debris, bits of truth, broken and incomplete, but still precious. The editors pieced them together into a narrative that stretched beyond comprehension. The storm was no longer weather, it was mythology. The tone varied with each publication. The Toronto Star wrote of heroism, men who stayed at the helm to the end, captains who went down bravely, as sailors must. The Detroit Free Press wrote of guilt, corporate negligence, ignored warnings, the greed of shipping companies that had sent men out against reason. The New York Times, far removed but enthralled, declared it the American sea tragedy. In small towns, local papers struggled to print their editions at all. The presses froze, the ink clumped. The staff were too busy digging graves to write obituaries. In Goderic, the Signal Star printed its headlines by hand for 2 issues, the owner using a single block press in his parlor. His lead story read simply, "We have counted 42 bodies. We expect more. No photograph, no embellishment, just truth, cold and clean." But even the truth could not stay still. Within weeks, stories began to twist. Some papers claimed a ship had vanished and reappeared, sailing crewless in the fog. Others printed tales of the ghost fleet, ships seen gliding under moonlight. their decks manned by shadows. The storm had become a ghost story before the ice had even melted. By Christmas, the headlines faded. War in Europe, scandals in Washington, a new automobile line in Detroit. Life marched on, as it always did. The storm that had taken 250 souls became a column inch, a memory buried beneath newer tragedies. But the people who lived along the Great Lakes never forgot. In the back rooms of taverns, men still unfolded those old papers and read the yellowed lines aloud, tracing the words with calloused fingers. The ink had dulled, but the stories had not. Every name still carried weight, every ship, a silence that stretched across generations. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled down the alleys of those lakeside towns, the presses in the old newspaper buildings groaned in their sleep, gears shifting, rollers turning faintly as though the papers themselves were trying to cry out again, to remind the living that ink, like water, never truly dries. The lake froze slowly that year, layer upon layer, until the water vanished under a plain of white so vast it seemed endless. The wind had lost its voice, leaving only stillness, the kind that pressed against the eardrums until a person imagined sound where there was none. In towns along Lake Huron's edge, people spoke less. Doors stayed closed longer. The storm had left a space between words that no one knew how to fill. The docks at Goderic stood empty, their ropes stiff as iron rods, their pilings rimed with frost. The warehouses that had once hummed with loading and shouting now sat dark, windows clouded with breath from no one. Seagulls no longer circled overhead. Even they had fled south. The lake's surface was smooth as glass beneath the snow, and when the sun struck it, it shone not white but silver, like a mirror turned to the sky. Yet beneath that stillness, everyone knew the wrecks remained, whole fleets entombed below. Each morning, the fishermen still walked to the shore out of habit. They stood in clusters, staring at the horizon, as though waiting for something to move. Some brought their children, small figures wrapped in wool scarves, to point out where their fathers had sailed from. There, they would say quietly, just beyond that bend in the ice. Then they would fall silent again, listening to the faint creaks that echoed underfoot, the sound of the lake shifting in its sleep. The winter came down hard. Snow buried the fences, the paths, the fields. In Sarnia, the church bells froze to silence. The ropes turned rigid with frost. In Alpena, men burned their furniture to stay warm after the coal shipment failed to arrive, the ships that carried it lying somewhere under the ice, their holds still full. In Bayfield, a widow named Clara Dalton opened her shutters every morning, lit a lamp, and placed it on her sill facing the lake. She never missed a day, even when the storms returned in smaller bursts. So they can see home, she said, though no one corrected her that the dead did not need light. Children grew up during that winter, with the sound of the storm told like legend. They whispered of ghost ships moving under the ice, of sailors whose faces could be seen if one stared long enough into the frozen water. Some swore that on the coldest nights they could hear the toll of the ship's bells from beneath the surface. Adults dismissed it, but they too kept their curtains drawn after dark. By January, the silence became something tangible. People described it like a blanket, soft but suffocating. Even the dogs stopped barking. Sound itself seemed to freeze, as if the world had paused out of respect. The lake no longer breathed, it waited. When spring finally came, it did not arrive with birds or flowers, but with a long, groaning crack that tore through the ice from Goderic to Point Clark. The noise was so loud it rattled windows and made people drop their tools. The ice split open, revealing dark water beneath black, still, eternal. For a moment, everyone feared the storm had returned, but the wind stayed calm. The lake simply exhaled. The thaw took weeks, slow and reluctant. The first gulls returned, circling over the open channels. Yet even as the water began to move again, the silence lingered. People found it hard to speak loudly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. The winter of silence had settled deep into their bones. and they carried it with them long after the snow melted like a frost that never truly left. And on certain nights, when the moon lay flat on the lake, its reflection smooth as polished steel, some swore the ice never really broke at all. They said it only turned invisible, thin as memory, holding the dead just beneath the surface. When the first thaw came, it did not feel like renewal. It came with groans and cracks that split through the ice like the breaking of bones. The towns along Lake Huron's edge awoke one morning to find the frozen plains of winter gone, replaced by a restless grey expanse that moved again, breathing, shifting, opening its jaws to release what it had held for months. The storm had been buried under silence, but the lake had not forgotten. It was time to return what remained. By early April, the salvagers were ready. They came from as far as Buffalo and Chicago, rough-handed men, with ropes, pulleys, and steam winches, eyes narrowed against the cold mist. Their ships were smaller than those that had perished, built not to carry freight but to recover it. They carried maps drawn from memory and hearsay, lists of coordinates guessed at from floating debris. Every captain among them had a reason to be there, a brother, a son, a friend. Somewhere beneath that black mirror of water, they began near the mouth of the Street Claire River, dragging iron hooks through the thawed currents. The lake resisted them, pulling at their cables, snapping ropes as though offended, but slowly, inevitably, it began to yield. The first thing they raised was not a ship or a body, but a single lifeboat. It came up upside down, half filled with ice, its oars still tied neatly inside. The men turned it over in the sunlight and saw the letters carved into the wood. Wexford. Word spread like fire. Within a week, the shores of Goderic were lined with watchers. They came carrying binoculars, shawls, and prayer books, their faces turned toward the horizon where the salvage boats worked. Each day they waited for something to break the surface, a barrel, a beam, a miracle. Each night, they went home with nothing but the sound of winches echoing across the dark water. On the 10th day, the lake relented. A diver, one of the few who dared descend into the cold depths, returned to the surface with trembling hands and a look that silenced everyone. "We've found her," he whispered. "The Regina." She lay upright on the lake bed, her decks intact, her name still visible beneath a veil of algae. Inside, the diver said, everything was as it had been on the night she vanished. Tools in their racks, boots by the door, tables set with tin plates. Time had stopped when the storm struck, and the lake had kept it that way. They brought up what they could: a compass, a bell, a logbook whose pages crumbled at a touch. Each item was set carefully on the docks, covered with canvas, and tagged with a date and location. The salvagers worked methodically, but even they grew quiet as the days went on. Each recovery felt less like victory and more like intrusion. One man said it best: "We're not rescuing them, we're waking them." By May, the thaw was complete. The lake rolled freely again, its ice gone but its memory intact. The salvagers packed their tools and left behind rows of crates filled with relics, mute witnesses to the storm's fury. The townspeople called them the offerings. Some were sent to museums, most were buried beside the empty graves of those never found. When the last salvage boat left harbor, the water was calm, unnervingly so. The surface rippled only once, a small wave that broke against the dock and then withdrew. It sounded almost like a sigh, and though the spring air was mild and the sky bright, those who watched the ships disappear swore they could feel the lake's eyes on them, deep, patient, and waiting for its chance to close again. She began appearing when the thaw was nearly done, when the last of the salvagers had packed up their gear, and the lake, for the first time since the storm, was still. At first, people thought she was another widow from the towns along the coast. She came alone, always on foot, following the line of the shore from Sarnia to Goderic, her oilskin coat snapping in the wind. Her boots were worn to the leather, her hair hidden beneath a black scarf, and she carried only a small satchel and a single lily, wrapped in paper. The fishermen called her the Lady of the Lake Road. The children, Boulder called her the ghost in yellow. She never stayed in one town for long. She rented small rooms near the docks, paid in coins rubbed thin from age, and vanished again before dawn. Wherever she stopped, someone would later find a lily placed at the water's edge, weighted with a small stone. No one knew her name, but the stories grew quickly. In Port Huron, they said she was the wife of a sailor from the Hydrus, searching for where the wreck lay. In Bayfield, they said she had lost 3 sons on different ships and was walking the coast to speak their names aloud to the lake. In Goderich, where the shoemaker had been found months before, people swore she had been seen kneeling beside his grave at twilight, murmuring words no one could understand. One afternoon, a dockhand named Michael Kerr approached her as she stood watching the horizon. He asked if she was looking for someone. She turned to him slowly, her eyes pale and distant. "No," she said. "They've already found me." Then she walked away, leaving the lily behind. She returned every year after that, always at the same time, early November, when the air turned sharp and the first snow threatened. Each visit followed the same pattern: a slow walk along the shore, a flower left at the waterline, and then her disappearance. Locals grew used to her presence, though no one ever learned where she came from or where she went. Some said she boarded the early ferry to Manitoulin. Others swore she walked straight into the lake itself. In 1917, a fisherman claimed he saw her standing knee-deep in the surf during a windless night. The water was calm, he said, but it rose up around her like a hand. She wasn't afraid. She leaned forward like she was listening. When he called out, she turned, smiled faintly, and said, "It's almost time." Then she was gone. The next morning, the first storm of that winter rolled in, shaking the houses and icing the harbors shut once more. By the 1920s, she was legend. Sailors swore that seeing her before a voyage meant bad weather ahead. Children whispered her story at night, daring one another to find her footprints in the sand. Some claimed they saw her reflection in the windows of the lighthouse at Point Clark, her silhouette flickering in the glass though the stairs inside were empty. Her last recorded sighting came in 1933, 20 years after the ghost storm. A young couple walking the beach near Kettle Point found a single lily laid neatly in the sand, the paper around it still dry. Nearby, faint but visible, were the marks of small boots leading toward the water, ending abruptly at the shoreline. No one ever saw her again, but each November, when the first winds rise and the snow begins to fall sideways across the Great Lakes, lilies still wash ashore in ones and twos, their petals unspoiled by the cold, and the people who find them know better than to ask how they got there. They only whisper, "She's walking again." It began with a light, a pale, steady glow hovering over the water near Thunder Bay, seen first by the night watchman at the grain elevator. He thought it a trick of his tired eyes, a reflection from the harbor lamps, perhaps, or the rising moon caught in mist. But then the light began to move. Slow, deliberate, almost graceful. It glided parallel to the shoreline, vanishing behind the fog bank before reappearing farther north. The watchman lifted his lantern, blinked, and felt the familiar chill of something unearthly. "There's a ship out there," he whispered. "But there shouldn't be." By morning, the story had spread through the town. The fishermen in the tavern called it nonsense, then paused when someone swore they'd seen it too. A full-rigged freighter, black as ink, its deck lamps glowing like eyes through the mist. No sound of engines, no whistle, no crew visible, just motion, silent and smooth, cutting across the lake's surface like a blade. It always appeared between dusk and midnight, always on calm water, and always vanished before dawn. The first to go looking for it was Captain Henry Lowell, a retired sailor who'd lost friends on the Wexford. He took his small tug, the Agnes Bell, out into the bay on the third night the light was reported. The water was flat as glass, reflecting the stars in perfect symmetry. At exactly 11, the air shifted warmer, sweeter, like the breath of spring, and then he saw it. The ship emerged from the fog with impossible clarity. Long, lean, its hull polished as if new, its decks lined with figures too still to be alive. The name on the bow was unreadable, the paint half dissolved into shadow. Lowell reached for his whistle, but the sound died before leaving his lips. Then the light of his lantern flickered and went out. He returned before dawn, pale and trembling. "It's them," he told the dockhands who found him. "The ones we lost, they're still sailing." He refused to explain further, only muttering, "Don't answer if they signal you." But others did not heed the warning. Word drew more boats out each night, curious souls, skeptics, and thrill-seekers hoping for proof of ghosts. Some saw nothing but mist. Others swore the lake changed around them, currents reversing, compasses spinning, sound dissolving into silence. One man claimed his boat's clock stopped at 9:12 and never worked again. A week later, it happened to another. Then, one evening, a group of divers exploring the waters off Thunder Bay reported finding a wreck that matched no known registry. Its hull was intact, but there was no growth of algae, no corrosion, no sign of time. "Like it just sank yesterday," one diver said. When they tried to mark the site, their buoy vanished overnight. The next day, the wreck was gone. The newspapers began calling it the ghost ship of Thunder Bay. For a while, tourists came to watch the lake after dark, cameras in hand, waiting for the light to return. It did sporadically, unpredictably. Always the same pale glow, always over the same stretch of water. Locals soon learned to avoid the bay on still nights. They said the lake was remembering itself, showing what it once held. "It's not haunting us," an old fisherman explained. "It's haunting itself. Even now, when fog drifts thick over Thunder Bay and the moon hides behind the clouds, some claim to see it again, the black freighter gliding silently past, its lamps dim, its wake unbroken. And if you listen closely, they say, you can hear the faint clatter of chains and the murmur of voices, working the decks of a ship that never found its harbor. Those who know the story do not linger long after dark, for on Lake Huron, they whisper, the dead still have their roots, and some storms never end, only change shape. By the spring after the storm, the lake had become calm in appearance, but beneath its mirror-like surface lay a labyrinth of wrecks and memories, frozen in time by cold and darkness. Divers who descended into the water quickly learned that the lake had its own rules. Visibility was near zero. The water pressed against their suits like a living weight, and the wrecks, even when found, seemed to resist being disturbed. For those who went down, the lake was less a body of water than a dream, a shifting, silent world, where time bent and reality folded in on itself. One of the first divers to return to the site of the Regina was Angus Delaney, a man already haunted by the sight of his lost crew and the knowledge of those still trapped beneath the waves. He had trained in colder waters, yes, but nothing could prepare him for the stillness that greeted him at 50 feet below the surface. The ship lay upright, dark and immense, her decks preserved in eerie perfection. Ice had encased the railings and lifeboats, glassing over chairs, tools, and equipment. Delaney swam carefully, his lantern throwing a golden glow over the scene, yet the shadows seemed to move on their own, curling around corners and under beams. He reached the captain's cabin and stopped mid-water. There, in the glow of his light, was a dining table still set, plates frozen in place with remnants of the last meal. The captain's logbook lay open, its pages splayed like the wings of a bird. Every detail had been stopped mid-motion, as though the storm had pressed pause on the lives within. Delaney felt a chill, not from the water, but from the weight of presence. The feeling that the crew, though gone, was still watching, still waiting. Later, after surfacing, he described the experience as a dream, though it was more vivid than any dream he had ever had. In the water, he had glimpsed figures moving through the decks, not floating lifelessly, but walking, bending, working, as if time had continued, underwater, hidden from the world above. He awoke with his wetsuit frozen stiff, hands trembling, and an understanding that the lake had preserved not just the bodies, but the essence of those who had died. Other divers followed. Each returned with similar tales. Some spoke of tools still in motion, of chains swinging as if recently secured. Others swore they saw the faint shimmer of eyes peering from the portholes, or the reflection of someone walking across the deck. Even though the vessel had long since capsized, few stayed more than an hour at a time, and all returned changed. Their dreams at night were filled with black water and ghostly crews, moving silently through corridors of steel, waiting for the living to join them. The townspeople along the shore heard the stories and whispered about them by the fire. Parents told their children that the lake kept the dead in its arms, a warning that curiosity could be dangerous. Fishermen avoided the deeper channels for weeks. Even the salvagers, hardened men used to wreckage and ice, spoke of the Regina's decks as if entering them were akin to entering a cathedral of the drowned. And still, late at night, when the moon lay flat across the black surface of Lake Huron, Delaney would dream again. In the dream, he walked the ship's deck, ice crunching under his boots, lantern in hand, hearing the faint hum of the storm that had long since passed. He could see them, the crew, moving through the corridors, working in silence, their faces pale and unblinking. He would wake with his heart hammering, knowing one truth: the lake did not forget, and those lost on the ghost storm of 1913 were not gone. They were simply waiting, preserved in a frozen, eternal dream. By late spring, when the ice had finally thinned and the lake's surface rippled with the first warm currents, the towns along Lake Huron began to notice something unusual. The waters seemed to hum, not a literal sound, but a resonance, subtle and persistent, that carried across the shores at dusk. Fishermen paused in their work to listen, and children pressed their ears against the hulls of boats moored at the docks. The sound was low and undulating, like a chord struck on an enormous string, vibrating through water, wood, and bone. Locals quickly called it the Song of the Lakes. It began quietly at first, as if the lake were clearing its throat. Sailors who had survived the storm said it was the voices of the lost, rising to greet those still living. The sound carried a rhythm that seemed to pulse in tandem with the tide, moving back and forth in a slow, deliberate cadence. The townspeople swore it was the echo of the storm itself, replaying faintly in the water, the waves singing, in memory of their fury. In Port Huron, a group of widows gathered by the water's edge each evening to hear it. They said the song reminded them of the last whistles of the ships, the cries of their husbands, sons, and brothers before they vanished into the white. "It's a lullaby," one whispered, from the lake to keep them calm. They sat on benches frozen in place by frost, listening to a melody that no one could write down, a cadence only the lake could compose. Fishermen began to alter their schedules. They would leave the docks in silence, rowboats cutting through black water, pausing midstream to catch the strange harmonics. The sound was sometimes so strong it vibrated the hulls beneath their feet. Some said they heard individual voices in it, men calling the names of wives or children, the faint creak of boards under booted feet, even the slap of a paddle that had long since been lost. They claimed that if you concentrated hard enough, you could feel the waves, carrying their work, their fear, their final moments, and the memory of what they had built, the pride of being sailors of the Great Lakes. In Goderich, the ice that had thawed along the shoreline seemed to ripple in time with the song, forming strange patterns, arcs of bubbles, and thin lines of trapped air. Some said it was the lake itself, dancing to the memory of the storm. Children would run along the edge, leaving small footprints that seemed to vanish into the ripples as if swallowed by invisible tides. Even the animals behaved differently. Dogs crouched quietly, their ears cocked, ears attuned to frequencies humans could barely perceive. Late one night, a man named Peter Quinn, who had survived the Charles S. Price, leaned against a railing in the harbor. He closed his eyes and let the song wash over him. It was not sorrowful, exactly, nor joyous. It was something older, something eternal. He swore he felt his lost crewmates near him, walking along the deck once more, steady in their routines, whispering reassurance. The song persisted through the seasons. It would fade during storms, vanish with fog, but it never truly left. The lake remembered, and in its song, the dead spoke not for the living, but for themselves. A haunting harmony that carried across Lake Huron, through Goderich, Port Huron, and beyond, echoing the memory of the ghost storm of 1913 long after the winds had gone. Among the relics pulled from the frozen waters of Lake Huron after the storm, one item stood out more than any other: a brass captain's watch recovered from the wreck of the Charles S. Price. It had been found clutched in the frozen hand of a sailor, lodged between deck beams, still ticking faintly despite months beneath ice-cold water. The hands were frozen at exactly 9:12, the moment the ship had rolled over, swallowed by waves taller than houses. For the townspeople and the families of the lost, it became a symbol, a heartbeat preserved against the silence of the lake. The watch was small, polished brass dulled by frost and salt, engraved with a name too worn to read. To the salvagers, it was just another piece of the wreck, a tool, a keepsake, a curiosity. But to those who had loved the men aboard the Price, it became sacred. Each morning, they would gather near the harbor to see it displayed on a slab of ice or a wooden box held by the harbor master. Some touched it reverently, pressing their fingers against the cold metal, imagining that the hands could tick backward, returning the men to their families. Captain George Mackay's widow, Margaret, insisted on seeing it herself. She arrived one grey morning, the wind pressing her coat tightly to her frame. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights. When the watch was brought out, she knelt on the frozen dock and whispered her husband's name. The hands did not move. They had stopped at 9:12, and they would never move again. But Margaret felt a strange comfort. It was proof that the moment of his death had been recorded, and that no storm, no ice, no lake could erase it. The townspeople began to tell stories about the watch. Fishermen claimed that, at night, it ticked faintly in rhythm with the lapping of the waves. Children whispered that if you held it against your ear, you could hear the captain's voice calling out orders, steady and unbroken, guiding the ship even as the storm consumed it. Scholars and journalists were skeptical, of course, but the story spread nonetheless. The watch became a legend of the ghost storm, an anchor between life and death. By late winter, the watch had a permanent place in the Sarnia Museum, displayed beneath glass, encircled by photographs of the crew and maps of the lake. People traveled for miles to see it, to touch the brass, to remember the men it represented. They would stand in silence, staring at the frozen hands, imagining the captain at the wheel, steady and vigilant, until the waves claimed him. Some nights, the keeper of the museum swore he could hear the faint tick, though no mechanism remained to make it. Visitors reported a sensation, subtle but undeniable, as if the captain was still watching the waters, still keeping his watch. Sailors who had survived the storm nodded when told. They understood. In their own way, they had left their own hands on the wheel. And so, the captain's watch remained, a frozen heartbeat at 9:12, marking the precise instant when the Charles S. Price slipped beneath the waves. It was not only a chronometer, it was memory, vigilance, and a silent testament to the men who refused to yield to the lake, even for a moment. In the museum, beneath the cold glass, time had stopped, but the story of the ghost storm endured, ticking forever in the hearts of those who remembered. By the spring following the storm, the communities along Lake Huron realized that no amount of ice, snow, or salvage could return the souls claimed by the water. They could recover timbers, tools, and the occasional personal item, but the men themselves were gone, and with them, the certainty of homecomings. It was then that the towns began the work of memorializing the lost, not on paper, not in ink, but in stone. In Goderich, a committee of widows, fathers, and local craftsmen convened in the town hall to discuss the monument. The idea was simple: a wall along the edge of the harbour, engraved with the names of every sailor lost in the ghost storm of 1913. There would be no distinction between rank or title. Captain or deckhand, engineer or cook the lake, had taken them all equally, and the stone should reflect that. Stonemasons arrived from Toronto and Collingwood, bringing slabs of grey granite polished to a dull shine. Each name was painstakingly carved, letter by letter, into the cold stone. Families waited in silence as the engravers worked. Some whispered prayers, others pressed gloved hands against the smooth surface, imagining that the touch would somehow reach the men beneath the water. Children trailed behind, reading the names aloud, giving voice to the lost, who could no longer speak. The monument grew over weeks. One slab was dedicated to the crew of the Charles S. Price, another to the Regina, and others for the Hydrus, the Wexford, and the John A. McGean. When it was finally complete, it stretched along the harbour like a frozen echo of the docks that had once been alive with sailors, ropes, and the smell of coal. Lanterns were hung along the walkway, lighting the names at night, their glow reflecting off the water in faint, wavering streaks. In Port Huron, a similar memorial was underway. Carpenters built a raised platform overlooking the lake, with granite plaques bearing the names of the lost. Families planted small flowers at its base, lilies and chrysanthemums chosen for their endurance in cold. Each name became a marker of memory, a promise that the men would not be forgotten. The town held a dedication ceremony on a calm morning in April. The air smelled of melted snow and iron, of the lake itself. Bells tolled once for each ship. Families bowed, their lips moving in silent prayer. The plaques were more than stone. They were history set in tangible form. Over time, veterans who had survived the storm visited, pointing out names of friends lost in the chaos, recalling their faces and voices in hushed tones. Sailors who had never been to the Great Lakes would come to pay respects, to run their fingers over the letters and feel connected to men they would never meet. Even decades later, the monuments remained sacred. Each November, townspeople left wreaths, small lanterns, or a single boot polished and placed deliberately on the stone. Stories were told to the children, of captains who held their decks until the waves claimed them, of deckhands who walked out of the snow only to find the horizon gone. The stones became more than names, they became memory itself, anchoring the tragedy in the physical world. And when the wind howls across the frozen lake at night, the townspeople say it carries the echoes of the lost, the faint creak of decks, the murmur of voices, and the names etched in stone glow softly in their minds. The lake has taken much, but through these stones, it has not taken everything. The memory of the men, their courage, and the ghost storm of 1913 endures, etched forever in grey granite. By late spring, when the ice had finally melted and the salvagers had retreated to their homes, the Great Lakes appeared calm, almost obedient. Yet those who had lived through the ghost storm of 1913 or watched its aftermath knew better. The water did not forget. Beneath its surface, black and still, lay the remnants of ships, the frozen forms of men, and the heavy, enduring weight of memory. The lakes themselves had become archivists, holding every action, every scream, every instant, in a deep, silent record. Fishermen, hesitant yet drawn by curiosity, noticed subtle signs first. Buoys bobbed slightly in water that should have been smooth. Ice floes that had drifted inland during the storm now returned to the center of the lake as though carried by an invisible hand. Currents shifted without explanation, spinning slowly, carrying debris and driftwood back toward places they had long passed. Experienced sailors muttered that the water itself remembered where each vessel had gone, tracing routes and movements that no map or compass could reproduce. In Goderich, the harbour was quiet in a way that felt alive. Men would watch the water for hours, noticing small undulations, patterns in the waves, a shimmer along the surface that seemed to suggest something moving beneath. One fisherman claimed to see a mast rise and fall in perfect rhythm with the swell, though no ship had ever passed there. Another swore he could hear faint creaking as if the timbers themselves remembered their last motion, bending and sighing underwater like living things. The divers who returned months later to examine the wrecks were not always welcomed with comfort. Each descent revealed more than the bodies and cargo. The lake seemed to replay moments from that night. A diver recalled looking down into the hold of the Regina and seeing what appeared to be the crew still moving tiny gestures, shifting positions, as if frozen life had not entirely relinquished its hold. His lantern would sweep over their forms, and he felt their awareness, faint but undeniable. When he surfaced, he refused to speak much for days, fearing that words would betray what the lake had chosen to keep secret. The water remembered the wind, too. On calm days, the surface would ripple in strange, perfect patterns, echoes of the gusts that had once torn ships from their courses. Fishermen described seeing waves rise unnaturally high before falling back flat, in sequences that matched the last known movements of the lost freighters. Experienced sailors said it was a warning, or perhaps a reminder, that the lake had its own mind and did not forgive or forget easily. Even the townsfolk learned to respect the lake's memory. Children were warned never to wander too far into the water alone. Boats were kept close to shore, rigging checked obsessively, and every November, as the first snows fell, lanterns were placed at the water's edge, small beacons, not for the living, but for the dead, whose names and positions the lake had not yet released. The lake remembered the storm, the men, the ships, and the silence that followed. It remembered the courage of those who fought, the panic of those lost, the grief of those waiting on shore. And, in its memory, it held them all in a perfect, unyielding balance. For those who watched it closely, the water could speak. It whispered through currents, moaned against docks, and shimmered beneath sunlight. And if one listened long enough, one could understand what the lake was saying, that it had seen everything, and it would never forget. Years passed, and the lake returned to its usual rhythms. Boats carried cargo once again, fishermen fished in familiar coves, and the towns along Lake Huron rebuilt their harbors and repaired their docks. But the memory of November 1913 never faded. Stories of the storm ships lost, men claimed, waves taller than houses were told and retold at kitchen tables, in schoolrooms, and across the benches of church pews. It was a story of loss and courage, of ice and wind, but most of all, it was a story the lake itself remembered. Every November, the air would shift, a bite would return to the wind, and snow would drift sideways across streets and docks. Locals knew the signs, the kind of cold that gnaws into the bones, the hush that falls before the snow really begins, the peculiar vibration in the ice and water that can only mean the lake is stirring. Even those too young to have been alive in 1913 were warned by elders. "She remembers," they said. The ghost storm returns every year in spirit, if not in fury. One evening, on a still lake, a young sailor named Thomas Kilmer noticed the unusual pattern of the waves. They did not roll naturally. They rose and fell with a rhythm almost deliberate, matching the cadence of men working at their stations long ago. He shivered, feeling an instinctive dread. From the shore, lights flickered faintly, not from the town but from somewhere in the mist over the water. He later told others it was as though the lost ships themselves were moving again, unseen and silent, carrying crews frozen in time. Elders along the shoreline spoke of sightings, a lantern floating far out on the lake, glimmering pale gold, moving steadily in the same direction each year. Children swore they could hear faint echoes of creaking timbers and muffled whistles over the frozen waters. Fishermen's compasses spun erratically in November, and nets sometimes snagged on what felt like invisible beams beneath the water. The lake had not forgotten its dead, and in some way, it was reminding the living that it still held power. In Goderich, A woman in an oilskin coat, some swore she was a widow who had never left the lake's edge, walked along the shoreline, laying lilies at the waterline. The flowers floated briefly before sinking, and she vanished into the night as quietly as she had appeared. Her presence, like the lanterns and the song of the waves, seemed to signal that the lake had not relinquished its claim, that the ghost storm had never truly ended. Even modern sailors knew to respect the waters in November. The ice and wind can rise suddenly, waves still climb higher than anticipated, and the fog can swallow a vessel in moments. Some claim that on nights when the moon is low and the lake is calm, you can see the ghostly shapes of ships moving in formation, their decks empty, lanterns flickering faintly, and hear the echo of men working silently, trapped between time and water. The ghost storm of 1913 had become more than an event. It had become a presence, not just a storm of wind and snow, but a spirit that lingered in the water, in the ice, in the cold November air. It returned each year in whispers, in reflections on the frozen lake, in the rhythm of waves that remembered every ship, every man, every frozen hand on a wheel. And so, the ghost storm returns. Every November, when the wind rises and the lake exhales its cold breath, the men of 1913 are there again, not fully alive, not fully gone, moving with the rhythm of the waves, waiting to be remembered by those who stand at the water's edge and dare to listen. The lake does not forgive, the lake does not forget, and those who hear its whisper know this truth. Some storms never truly end, they only change shape, returning to claim memory, silence, and awe.